Chapter 1. The Last Birthday Party. Petunia Dursley had always prided herself on throwing perfect birthday parties. The sitting room of No. 4 Privet Drive gleamed under her meticulous attention. Every surface polished to mirror brightness, every cushion precisely arranged. The dining table groaned under the weight of Dudley's birthday feast, a chocolate cake shaped like a tank, 43 presents wrapped in expensive paper, and enough sweets to stock a confectionery. 5-year-olds from the neighborhood would arrive within the hour, and everything would be exactly as it should be. She paused in the doorway, surveying her domain with satisfaction that felt hollow in her chest. Nearly 4 years of these parties now, each one more elaborate than the last. Dudley's first birthday had been a modest affair, just family and a handful of friends. But as the years passed and Vernon's salary climbed, the celebrations had grown into productions worthy of royalty. Or perhaps, she admitted, in the privacy of her thoughts, they'd grown to compensate for the small, dark-haired boy who helped carry plates and was never invited to participate. "Mummy, is it time yet?" Dudley bounced into the room, his round face flushed with excitement. At 5 years old, he was already showing signs of his father's broad build, though, where Vernon carried his weight with aggressive confidence, Dudley simply radiated the comfortable expectation that the world existed to please him. "Not quite yet, darling. The other children will be here soon." Petunia smoothed his hair, which had been freshly cut and styled that morning. "Why don't you go check that your cousin has finished setting out the paper cups?" Dudley's face darkened at the mention of Harry. He better not touch anything. Daddy says freaks aren't supposed to touch normal things. The word hung in the air like a slap, and Petunia felt something twist unpleasantly in her stomach. She wanted to correct him, to say that calling people names was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. After all, hadn't she spent years telling herself the same thing? That Harry was different, dangerous, unnatural. That keeping him separate from Dudley's world was protecting her son. Just go check on the cups, Dudley. In the kitchen, she found Harry standing on a wooden step stool at the counter, carefully arranging paper cups in neat rows. At 4 years old, he was small for his age, all sharp elbows and knees that seemed too large for his thin frame. His dark hair fell in messy waves that no amount of brushing could tame, and behind his oversized glasses, the cheapest pair they could find at the NHS clinic, his green eyes held an alertness that sometimes unnerved her. Those eyes. Lily's eyes. "I put them like you showed me, Aunt Petunia," Harry said softly, not looking up from his work, all the sane distance apart. His voice carried the careful cadence of a child who had learned that speaking too loudly or too eagerly brought unpleasant consequences. It was a tone that had developed gradually over the past 3.5 years, and each time Petunia heard it, she felt the familiar stab of something she refused to name. That's fine," she said, her voice rougher than she intended. "When you're finished, go to your room. The party isn't for you." Harry's small shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, but he nodded without complaint. "Yes, Aunt Petunia." She watched him climb down from the step stool, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to make sudden movements or loud noises. He passed her on his way to the door. She caught a whiff of the generic brand soap she bought for him, so different from the expensive toiletries Dudley used. The comparison made her chest tighten. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock, and the house filled with the chaos of 5-year-olds, hopped up on excitement and sugar. Petunia threw herself into hostess mode, distributing party hats and organizing games with the manic energy of someone trying not to think. Mrs. Pocus gushed over the decorations. Mrs. Mason complimented the cake. Little Piers Pocus demanded to know why Dudley got so many presents when it wasn't even Christmas. For nearly an hour, It was perfect. Exactly the kind of normal, cheerful gathering that proved the Dursleys were a respectable family with nothing unusual about them whatsoever. Then came the cake. Harry had appeared in the doorway as she began lighting the candles, drawn perhaps by the singing or simply by the magnetic pull of celebration. She'd noticed him hovering there, careful to stay out of sight of the other adults, but close enough to watch. She should have sent him away immediately. Should have remembered Vernon's rules about keeping Harry separate from anything involving other people. Instead, she'd found herself gesturing him forward. "Help me carry the plates to the table." It was a small kindness born from the treacherous part of her heart that sometimes forgot why Harry had to be kept apart. Harry's face had lit up with such grateful surprise that she'd had to look away, focusing instead on the chorus of Happy Birthday beginning in the sitting room. They'd made it to the table without incident. Harry had even managed to help serve the first few slices, his small hand steady as he passed plates to the waiting children. Petunia had begun to relax, to think that perhaps this once, nothing would go wrong. That was when Dudley's new remote-controlled car, his favorite gift, the one that had cost Vernon nearly a week's salary, went careening off the coffee table and hit the wall with a sickening crack. The singing stopped. The children fell silent. Harry stood frozen beside the cake, one small hand still extended from where he'd been reaching for another plate, his face pale with the dawning realization of what had just happened. "I didn't mean to," Harry whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was just trying to." "You little freak!" Vernon's roar filled the room like thunder. He'd been standing near the window, basking in the compliments about their home and their son, when the car had suddenly jerked to life on its own and launched itself across the room. Now his face was purple with rage as he advanced on Harry, his massive frame blocking out the light from the window. "I wasn't even touching it," Harry protested, backing against the table. "I was helping with the cake. I didn't." "Don't you dare lie to me." Vernon's hand shot out and grabbed Harry's arm, jerking him away from the table with enough force to make him stumble. "We all saw what you did, you unnatural little..." "Vernon." Petunia's voice cut through his tirade, though it came out weaker than she'd intended. Around them, the party guests were beginning to murmur among themselves, their expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. Mrs. Mason was reaching for her handbag. Mrs. Polkiss was staring at Vernon as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Look at it." Vernon held up the broken car, its plastic shell cracked and wheels hanging at odd angles. £40 this cost me. £40 for Dudley's birthday. And this little freak ruins it just by being in the same room. "Daddy, my car." Dudley had begun to cry, great heaving sobs that made his face red and blotchy. "He broke my birthday car." "It was an accident," Harry said desperately, tears beginning to stream down his own face. "Please, Uncle Vernon, I didn't mean to. I can fix it, maybe, if you let me." "Fix it?" Vernon's laugh was harsh and ugly. "You'll fix it by staying where you belong." He began dragging Harry toward the door, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "In your cupboard, where freaks like you can't ruin things for normal people." The room had gone completely silent now, except for Dudley's wailing and the sound of Harry's bare feet sliding across the hardwood floor as Vernon hauled him away. Petunia saw Mrs. Mason gathering her children, mumbling excuses about early bedtimes. Mrs. Polkiss was speaking in sharp, whispered tones to her husband, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. "Perhaps we should go," someone said. "Give Dudley some time to calm down." "Yes," Vernon said, not loosening his grip on Harry's arm. "Yes, I think that's best. I'm terribly sorry about this. Sometimes children with problems, they just can't control themselves around normal activities." Children with problems, as if Harry were some feral creature that had wandered in from the street, rather than a 4-year-old boy who'd been trying to help serve cake within minutes. The house was empty, except for family. Vernon shoved Harry toward the cupboard under the stairs, his movements sharp with frustrated rage. "Get in there and think about what you've done. No dinner tonight. Maybe hunger will teach you to keep your freakishness to yourself." "Vernon, he's just a child," Petunia began, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "A child?" Vernon whirled to face her, his small eyes bright with fury. "A child doesn't make toys move across the room just by looking at them. A child doesn't ruin birthday parties with unnatural tricks. That thing in there is exactly what Dumbledore left on our doorstep. A freak that should have been handed over to an asylum the moment we realized what it was." He slammed the cupboard door with enough force to rattle the hinges, then turned on his heel and stalked toward the kitchen. "Clean up this mess," he called over his shoulder. "And next time, remember why we keep that thing separate from decent folk." Petunia stood alone in the ruins of the party, surrounded by abandoned paper plates and half-eaten cake. Through the thin wood of the cupboard door, she could hear Harry's muffled sobs, the sound barely audible, but somehow piercing straight through to some locked chamber in her chest. Dudley had stopped crying and was now examining his broken car with scientific interest, poking at the damaged wheels and muttering about how Harry should have to buy him a new one. Around them, decorations hung like cheerful mockeries of the celebration that had collapsed so completely. She began cleaning mechanically, stacking plates and gathering abandoned party hats while her mind churned. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Over the past year, strange things had been occurring with increasing frequency whenever Harry was upset or frightened. Plates would slip from Vernon's hands just as he raised them to strike. Lights would flicker when Harry cried. Once, memorably, all the windows in the house had rattled for nearly an hour after Vernon had locked Harry in the cupboard for breaking a glass. Vernon called it freakishness and responded with increasing hostility. Petunia called it nothing at all, because naming it would mean acknowledging what she'd spent 4 years trying to forget, that Harry was her sister's son, and Lily had been able to do impossible things too. That night, after Vernon had fallen asleep in front of the television, and Dudley was safely tucked into his bed, surrounded by his remaining toys, Petunia found herself standing outside the cupboard door. From inside came the soft, heartbroken sounds of a small child crying himself to sleep, the same sounds she'd been hearing and ignoring for nearly 4 years. She pressed her hand against the wood, feeling the vibration of Harry's quiet sobs. In her mind, she could see him curled up on the thin mattress Vernon had grudgingly provided, still wearing his good clothes from the party, probably wondering what he'd done wrong and how he could be better tomorrow, just like Lily used to do when their parents punished her for making flowers bloom out of season or turning her hair different colors when she was angry. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Lily, at 7 years old, crying in her bedroom after their father had shouted at her for making the neighbors' roses grow twice their normal size. Lily at 9, sobbing that she was sorry. So sorry she hadn't meant to make the teacup float. She'd tried so hard to be normal. And what had Petunia done? She'd stood outside Lily's door just like this, listening to her sister cry, and done nothing. Worse than nothing. She'd joined in the accusations the next day, calling Lily a freak and a show-off, anything to distance herself from the girl who could do impossible things. She'd told herself she was protecting her family's reputation, protecting her marriage from the scandal of harboring a magical child, but standing here in the dark, listening to Harry's broken breathing through the thin wood, she could no longer pretend she didn't know what she was really protecting. Her own cowardice, her own desperate need to be normal, acceptable, part of the world that had rejected her sister so thoroughly. When had she become this person? When had she started looking at a 4-year-old child, Lily's child, and seeing a burden rather than a blessing? When had Vernon's cruelty become so routine that she simply worked around it like a piece of furniture? The answer came with brutal clarity, the moment she'd decided that being normal was more important than being kind. In the kitchen, Vernon snored peacefully in his chair, surrounded by the debris of Dudley's ruined party. Upstairs, Dudley slept the untroubled sleep of a child who'd never known want or fear. And, in between them, locked in a space barely large enough for a child to lie down, Harry wept for a broken toy and a love that never came. Petunia climbed the stairs to her bedroom with legs that felt made of lead. In the wardrobe, behind the good dresses she wore to Vernon's company functions, she found her old suitcase, the one she'd carried when she left Cokeworth for London, young and full of dreams about the normal life she would build. She began to pack. She folded Harry's few clothes, the hand-me-downs from Dudley, that hung loose on his smaller frame, the glasses held together with tape, the single stuffed animal he'd managed to keep hidden from Vernon's periodic clean-outs of anything that might bring Harry comfort. As she worked, she felt something shifting inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. Tomorrow was Monday. Vernon would go to work, and Dudley would go to his playgroup, and Harry would spend another day learning that wanting things was dangerous, and caring about anything was a mistake, unless she chose differently. She closed the suitcase and hid it under her bed, then lay awake until dawn, listening to her husband's snores and making plans that felt like prayer. Chapter 2. The Woman on Platform 9. The first train to London left Little Whinging at 6:30 in the morning, when the platform was still empty, except for a handful of commuters clutching coffee cups like lifelines. Petunia had never been so grateful for Vernon's predictable schedule. He wouldn't wake until 7, wouldn't discover their absence until nearly 8, when he came downstairs expecting breakfast on the table. By then, she and Harry would be lost in the sprawling anonymity of London. 2 more faces in a crowd of 8 million. Aunt Petunia, where are we going? Harry asked for the 3rd time, his small hand clasped tightly in hers as they found seats in an empty compartment. He was wearing his best clothes, a pair of Dudley's hand-me-downs that had been taken in as much as possible, but still hung loose on his thin frame. In his free hand, he clutched the stuffed rabbit she'd rescued from the cupboard, its grey fur worn smooth from years of secret cuddling. On a holiday, she said, the lie sitting bitter on her tongue. Just the 2 of us. Won't that be nice? Harry nodded solemnly, though confusion flickered behind his glasses. At 4 years old, he understood that trips usually involved Uncle Vernon making loud proclamations about schedules, and Dudley demanding to know what presents he would get at their destination. This quiet escape, with its hushed voices and careful movements, felt different. The train pulled away from the station with a mechanical sigh that seemed to echo in Petunia's chest. Through the window, she watched the familiar streets of Little Whinging scroll past, the neat rows of identical houses, the perfectly manicured lawns, the world she'd built her entire adult life around. In a few hours, Vernon would discover the note she'd left on the kitchen table. Gone to think. Don't follow us. Not much of an explanation for 17 years of marriage. But then again, she wasn't sure she could articulate the feeling that had settled in her chest last night. It was something like drowning. If drowning could happen while standing perfectly still in a room full of birthday decorations and broken toys. Will Uncle Vernon come too? Harry asked, and there was something carefully neutral in his voice that made her heart clench. No, she said, more firmly than she'd intended. No, he won't. Harry considered this for a moment, then nodded again. He pressed his face to the window, watching the countryside blur past. And Petunia was struck by how easily he accepted this disruption to his world. 4 years old, and already he'd learned not to ask too many questions about adult decisions. Already he'd learned that sometimes the people who were supposed to care for you did incomprehensible things, and the safest response was quiet compliance. The realization made her feel sick. London engulfed them like a living thing, all noise and movement and smells that had no equivalent in the sterile suburbs of Surrey. King's Cross Station teemed with travellers, their voices blending into a constant hum of destination and departure. Petunia stood on the platform, one hand gripping her small suitcase and the other holding Harry's, suddenly aware that she had no plan beyond getting as far away from Vernon as possible. "It's very loud," Harry observed, pressing closer to her side as a group of teenagers jostled past, their voices raised in laughter that felt sharp against her nerves. "Yes," she agreed, scanning the crowd for some sign of what they should do next. "It's different from home." But even as she said it, she wondered if home was the right word for the house on Privet Drive. Home implied safety, warmth, belonging. What they'd left behind was more like a prison, with good china and matching curtains. She found herself staring at Platform 9, remembering the last time she'd been in this station. It had been September 1970, 15 years ago now, when their parents had insisted she accompany them to see Lily off for her first year at that school. Petunia had been 16 and sullen with embarrassment, convinced that people were staring at their family, wondering why they were saying goodbye to an 11-year-old, as if she were going off to university instead of some special school for troubled children. That was how she'd chosen to understand it then. A school for children who couldn't fit into normal institutions. It was easier than accepting what Lily had tried to tell her about magic and wands and moving pictures. The memory felt different now. Viewed through the lens of everything that had happened since, she could picture Lily as clearly as if it were yesterday, small for her age, overwhelmed by the size of the station and the weight of her trunk, but vibrating with excitement about the adventure ahead. Their mother had been crying openly. Their father had been trying to look stern and failing. And Petunia had been watching a woman in emerald green robes who seemed to materialize near Platform 9 whenever their parents weren't looking. The woman had been tall and severe-looking, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she'd been observing their family with sharp eyes behind square spectacles. When she'd noticed Petunia staring, she'd nodded once, a gesture that had somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and dismissal. At the time, Petunia had convinced herself she'd imagined the woman, or that she was some sort of social worker keeping an eye on unusual families. Now, standing in the same spot with Harry's small hand in hers, she wondered if that woman had been from Lily's world. Someone who understood the weight of magic and the cost of keeping it secret. "Aunt Petunia," Harry tugged on her sleeve, "are we going to stand here all day?" "No," she said, forcing herself to move. "No, we're going to explore." Through the British Museum, where Harry stared in wonder at ancient artifacts and asked questions she couldn't answer about how people had lived so long ago. Past shop windows full of things they couldn't afford, down streets that smelled of exhaust fumes and possibility. Petunia bought them lunch from a corner shop, sandwiches and crisps that they ate sitting on a bench in Russell Square, while pigeons begged for crumbs. Harry shared his sandwich with the birds without being asked, breaking off small pieces of bread and throwing them with careful aim. His face was more relaxed than she'd seen it in months, free from the constant tension that characterized his expression at home. away from Vernon's looming presence and Dudley's casual cruelty. He looked like what he was, a small boy on an adventure. "The birds are hungry," he said solemnly, watching a particularly bold pigeon hop closer to their bench. "Yes, they are. Uncle Vernon says feeding pigeons just makes more pigeons, and then they make messes on cars." "Uncle Vernon says a lot of things." Harry looked up at her, something shifting in his expression. "Don't you like Uncle Vernon?" It was the kind of question that should have been simple to answer. "He's your uncle," she should have said. "He takes care of you. He provides for our family." All the responses she'd been giving herself for years whenever doubt crept in. Instead, she found herself saying, "Do you like Uncle Vernon?" Harry was quiet for a long moment, picking at the crust of his sandwich. When he spoke, his voice was smaller than usual. "I try to, but he's always angry at me, and I don't know why. I try to be good, but I still make him mad." "Oh, sweetheart." The endearment slipped out before she could stop it, and Harry looked at her in surprise. She couldn't remember the last time she'd called him anything but his name. Couldn't remember when she'd started rationing affection like it was something that could run out. "You are good," she said, and meant it. "You're a very good boy, Harry. If Uncle Vernon can't see that, it's because something's wrong with him, not with you." Harry stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. 4 years old, and he was already surprised by kindness from the people who were supposed to love him. The thought made her chest tight with a shame that had no easy remedy. They were walking past a row of shops near Bloomsbury when it happened. Harry had been asking questions about the buildings, wondering aloud how many people could live in structures so tall, when a group of teenagers came barreling down the sidewalk, laughing and shoving each other with the careless violence of youth. One of them clipped Harry's shoulder as he passed, sending him stumbling toward a shop window. The boy caught himself before he could fall, but his small hands pressed against the glass for balance. The window had been cracked, a spiderweb of damage spreading from one corner where someone had thrown a rock or bottle. Petunia was reaching for Harry, ready to pull him away from the sharp edges, when the crack began to disappear. It started slowly, like ice melting in reverse. The fracture lines faded and vanished, leaving the glass whole and clear. Harry's palms were still pressed against the surface, his face pale with confusion, and something that might have been fear. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, the same words he'd spoken the night before when Dudley's toy car had careened across the room. "I was just scared they were going to hurt me. And I wanted the glass to be strong." And then it was, "It's all right." Petunia glanced around quickly, but no one else seemed to have noticed. The teenagers were already gone, and the few other pedestrians were absorbed in their own concerns. "It's all right, Harry." But it wasn't all right, and they both knew it. This was what Vernon had been raging about, what he'd spent 4 years trying to suppress with rules and punishments and isolation. This was magic, real and undeniable, flowing out of her nephew like light from a broken lamp. This was Lily all over again. That evening, as darkness settled over London like a gentle blanket, Petunia found herself sitting on a bench in Regent's Park, with Harry curled against her side, both of them exhausted and uncertain. She'd spent the day trying to work up the courage to contact someone, her parents perhaps, or one of Vernon's colleagues who might know about emergency accommodations. But each time she'd approached a phone box, pride and shame had stopped her. How could she explain that she'd left her husband because he'd been too cruel to a child? How could she admit that she'd finally realized what kind of person she'd become? How could she justify taking Harry away from the only home he'd known without having anywhere better to offer him? "Are we going home tomorrow?" Harry asked, his voice muffled against her coat. "I don't know," she said honestly. Round them, the park was settling into evening quiet, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional call of night birds. "Would you like to go home?" Harry was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was very small. "I don't want Uncle Vernon to be angry at me anymore." "He won't be," she said, though she wasn't sure how she could promise such a thing. "I won't let him be angry at you anymore. Can you really stop him?" Could she? She was one woman with no money of her own, no career, no resources beyond her savings account, and whatever was in Vernon's wallet, which she'd taken from his dresser that morning with hands that shook with theft and righteousness in equal measure. But Harry was looking at her with something that might have been hope, and she found herself nodding. "Yes," she said, "I can stop him." As Harry finally drifted off to sleep against her shoulder, Petunia stared up at the London sky and tried to remember everything Lily had ever told her about her world, the school with the strange name, the people in robes who could make impossible things happen, the government that existed parallel to the one she knew, governing lives lived in shadows and secrecy. Vernon had always insisted that ignoring magic would make it go away, that pretending Harry was normal would somehow make him normal. That, shutting out Lily's world completely, was the only way to protect their family from contamination. But Vernon had been wrong about many things, and this was just one more item on a list that grew longer every year. Harry needed help that she couldn't provide. He needed people who understood what he was, who could teach him to control the power that frightened him and guide him toward whatever future awaited children like him. He needed what Lily had found when she'd walked through the barrier at platform 9 3/4 and discovered that she wasn't alone in the world. Tomorrow, Petunia decided, she would find someone from that world, someone who could look at Harry and see potential instead of problems, magic instead of freakishness, someone who could help her give him what Vernon never had, a chance to be exactly who he was meant to be. The night air carried the scent of grass and distant rain, and for the first time in years, Petunia felt something like peace settle in her chest. It was fragile and uncertain, built on nothing more substantial than hope and determination, but it was real. Tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, Harry was safe in her arms, and she was finally moving towards something better instead of running from something worse. It was, she thought, a beginning. Chapter 3. The Letter to Hogwarts. The British Library opened its doors at 9:30 in the morning, and Petunia was waiting on the steps when the first librarian arrived for work. She'd spent the night on a bench in Russell Square with Harry curled against her side, both of them shivering under her thin coat, as London settled into the peculiar quiet that came just before dawn. Harry had slept fitfully, whimpering occasionally from dreams she couldn't soothe, while she'd stared at the empty streets and tried to find the courage for what she needed to do. By morning, desperation had made the decision for her. "Are we going to read books today?" Harry asked as they climbed the library steps, his small hand still clutched tightly in hers. He looked rumpled and tired, his dark hair sticking up at odd angles and his glasses sitting crooked on his nose. But there was cautious excitement in his voice. Books were safe. Books couldn't shout, or lock you in cupboards, or break your toys out of spite. "Yes," Petunia said. The reading wasn't exactly what she had in mind. "We're going to research something." The main reading room was vast and hushed, filled with long wooden tables and the soft scratch of pens on paper. Petunia found them seats near the back, away from the clusters of university students and researchers who populated the front rows. Harry climbed onto his chair and immediately became absorbed in a picture book about trains that someone had left behind, his lips moving silently as he traced the words with his finger. Petunia stared at the blank sheet of paper she borrowed from the librarian's desk, her pen hovering uncertainly above the surface. How did one write a letter to someone who might not exist? How did one ask for help from a world that had no official existence, no telephone number, no postal address that could be found in any directory? But Lily had written letters home during her school years, hadn't she? And they'd arrived by normal post, delivered by postmen who'd never questioned the strange destination printed on the envelopes. If letters could reach Hogwarts from the outside world, perhaps letters could reach it from London as well. The problem was knowing what to say. "Dear Professor McGonagall," she wrote, then stopped. Did she remember the name correctly? Lily had mentioned her teachers in letters, usually with the sort of casual familiarity that came from daily contact, but it had been nearly 15 years since those letters stopped coming. Professor McGonagall had been the stern one, she thought. The one who taught, what had Lily called it? Transfiguration? "You don't know me," she continued, then crossed it out. That sounded too uncertain, too much like someone who could be easily dismissed. She needed to sound desperate but not hysterical, worried but not mad. "My name is Petunia Dursley, and I am the sister of Lily Evans. Lily Potter." Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote Lily's married name. It still felt strange to think of her sister as anything but Evans, the girl who'd grown up in the room next to hers, who'd made flowers bloom in winter and teacups dance in circles, just to make their father laugh. "I know you may not remember me," she wrote, though she rather suspected no one at Lily's school would have forgotten the bitter sister who'd refused to attend her wedding or acknowledge her existence for the last years of her life. "But I need help with Harry." Harry looked up at the sound of his name, offering her a shy smile before returning to his book. He was being so good, sitting quietly and entertaining himself while she struggled with words that felt too large for her mouth. At 4 years old, he'd already learned the survival skill of making himself invisible when adults were wrestling with problems he couldn't understand. "He's been living with me and my husband since what happened to Lily and James. But my husband, he doesn't understand about children like Harry, about children who can do the things Harry can do." She paused, staring at what she'd written. It sounded mad when put into words, even to her own eyes. Children who could fix broken glass with their hands. Children who made toys move across rooms when they were frightened. Children who were exactly like Lily had been, back when Petunia had been too young and too jealous to understand what a gift that was. "My husband has been unkind to Harry, very unkind. I've taken Harry away from him, but I don't know how to care for a magical child. I don't know how to help him learn to control what he can do, or how to explain why he's different from other children his age." "Aunt Petunia?" Harry had set down his book and was looking at her with concern. "Why are you crying?" She touched her cheek and was surprised to find it wet. "I'm not crying, sweetheart. I'm just thinking very hard about something." "Are you writing a letter?" "Yes." "To Uncle Vernon?" "No." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "To someone who might be able to help us." Harry nodded solemnly, as if the idea of needing help was perfectly reasonable to him. He probably understood desperation better than most children his age, had probably been hoping for rescue longer than she'd been willing to admit it was necessary. "I know I have no right to ask for help," she continued writing. "I know I wasn't kind to Lily when she was alive, and I know you probably think I don't deserve consideration. But Harry does. He's just a little boy, and he's scared, and he doesn't understand why the things he can do make people angry." The words were coming easier now, flowing out of her like water through a broken dam. All the things she'd been thinking but not saying. All the fears she'd been carrying alone. I can't give him what he needs. I don't understand his world, and I can't teach him how to live in it safely. But I love him, and I want him to have a chance to grow up without being afraid of what he is. She signed the letter with shaking hands. Petunia Dursley, formerly Evans. Getting the letter delivered was another challenge entirely. The post office clerk looked at her strangely when she asked about sending mail to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Scotland, but eventually accepted her money and assured her the letter would be sent to the address as written, even if it seemed a bit unusual. They returned to the library to wait, though for what exactly, Petunia wasn't sure. In the stories Lily had told, the magical world had its own ways of doing things, its own systems that operated parallel to the mundane world of postal codes and telephone exchanges. If Professor McGonagall still worked at Hogwarts, if she remembered Lily, if she cared enough about Harry to respond to a desperate letter from a sister who'd spent years rejecting everything magical. Too many ifs, too much hope pinned on too little certainty. Harry had found another book, something about animals in Africa, and was absorbed in pictures of elephants and giraffes when the owl arrived. It came through the library's tall windows, like a brown and gold thunderbolt, settling on their table, with a soft flutter of wings that somehow didn't disturb any of the papers scattered across the surface. The other library patrons continued their reading as if nothing unusual had happened, though Petunia could have sworn she heard someone's pen stop scratching for just a moment before resuming its rhythm. The owl was magnificent, all fierce eyes and sharp talons, with a scroll of parchment tied to its leg with thin leather cord. It fixed Petunia with a stare that seemed far too intelligent for a bird, and extended its leg expectantly. "Is that for us?" Harry whispered, his eyes wide with wonder and delight. He'd never seen an owl up close before, had probably never imagined that birds could carry letters like miniature postmen. "I think so." Petunia's hands shook as she untied the scroll. The parchment felt different from normal paper, thicker, more substantial, with a texture that spoke of craftsmanship rather than mass production. The writing on it was crisp and precise, formed with a fountain pen in dark green ink. "Mrs. Dursley, I remember your sister very well, and I am deeply concerned by what you have written regarding young Harry's circumstances. I will arrive in London this afternoon to assess the situation personally. Please remain at the British Library until I can reach you. McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. P.S. Please do not be alarmed by Hedwig's appearance. She is quite harmless and will wait for a reply if you wish to send one." The owl, Hedwig, apparently, tilted her head and made a soft hooting sound that might have been encouragement. Petunia looked around for something to write with, suddenly aware that her ordinary ballpoint pen seemed inadequate for corresponding with the magical world. "You can pet her," Harry said quietly. "She likes you. I can tell." "How can you tell?" Harry shrugged, the gesture of a child who accepted mysteries as part of life. "She's not scary. She feels kind." Petunia reached out hesitantly and touched the owl's head. Her feathers were impossibly soft, and she made a pleased, trilling sound that vibrated through Petunia's fingers. For just a moment, sitting in the British Library, with an owl on their table, and her nephew smiling with genuine delight for the first time in days, magic felt like a gift rather than a burden. Professor McGonagall arrived at 4:30, sweeping through the library doors in a way that suggested she was accustomed to making dramatic entrances. She was exactly as Petunia remembered from that glimpse 15 years ago, tall and severe, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp eyes behind square spectacles. Her robes had been replaced by a crisp navy suit that looked expensive and perfectly tailored. But there was no mistaking the air of authority that surrounded her like armor. She found them easily, as if she could sense where they were sitting among the dozens of tables and hundreds of patrons. When her gaze fell on Harry, her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Dursley," she said, settling into the chair across from them, with a grace that spoke of years spent managing classrooms full of unruly teenagers. "And you must be Harry." Harry looked up from his book. He'd moved on to a volume about castles, and studied Professor McGonagall with the careful attention he usually reserved for adults who might pose a threat. After a moment, he seemed to reach some internal conclusion and smiled shyly. "Hello," he said. "Are you from my mum's school?" "I am indeed. I taught your mother transfiguration, the magic of changing one thing into another. She was one of my most talented students." Something in Professor McGonagall's voice when she mentioned Lily made Petunia's throat tighten. There was warmth there, and genuine fondness, and underneath both a note of grief that spoke of a teacher who had lost not just a student, but someone she genuinely cared about. "She could make flowers," Harry said with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child sharing important information. "Aunt Petunia told me she could make them grow, even when it wasn't the right time." Yes, she could. Among many other remarkable things, Professor McGonagall's gaze shifted to Petunia, and something in her expression suggested she understood exactly how difficult this conversation must be. "Perhaps we could speak privately for a moment. There are some things I need to understand about Harry's current situation." They moved to a quiet corner near the reference desk, leaving Harry absorbed in his book under the watchful eye of a librarian who seemed inexplicably charmed by the small boy reading about medieval architecture. "Professor." McGonagall listened without interruption as Petunia explained Vernon's treatment of Harry, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper when she described the cupboard and the punishments, and the constant message that Harry was unwanted and unnatural. "I see," Professor McGonagall said when Petunia finished. Her voice was carefully neutral, but there was something cold and dangerous glittering behind her spectacles. "And how long has this been going on?" "Since the beginning, really. It got worse as Harry got older and started showing signs of what he could do. Vernon couldn't pretend he was normal anymore. Mr. Dursley was informed, when Harry was placed with you, that he was a wizard. He was told that Harry would need understanding and guidance as his abilities developed. Vernon doesn't listen to things he doesn't want to hear." Professor McGonagall made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been barely suppressed fury. She looked across the library at Harry, who was now sharing his castle book with the librarian, pointing out details in the pictures, with enthusiasm that made him look like any other curious 4-year-old. "I need to examine him," she said finally, "not physically, magically, to assess what damage has been done and what can be repaired." The examination took place in a private study room that Professor McGonagall somehow procured without speaking to anyone official. She had Harry sit in a comfortable chair and asked him simple questions while moving her hands in complicated patterns that left trails of soft light in the air. Harry watched the light with fascination, occasionally reaching out to touch the glowing threads that sparkled and dissolved at his contact. "Can you show me something magical, Harry?" Professor McGonagall asked gently. "Something you've done before that made the adults upset?" Harry looked uncertain, glancing at Petunia for permission. She nodded encouragingly, though her heart was racing with the fear that whatever he showed them would convince Professor McGonagall that he was too damaged or too dangerous to help. Instead, Harry smiled and held out his hand. A moment later, the broken pencil on the desk began to repair itself, wood and metal flowing back together until it was whole and sharp again. It was such a small magic, such a gentle one, but Professor McGonagall's breath caught audibly. "Remarkable," she murmured. "Harry, that was beautifully done. How did it feel to do that?" "Like fixing something that was sad." Professor McGonagall spent several more minutes with her lights and patterns, occasionally making small sounds of interest or concern. When she finished, her expression was thoughtful and somewhat grim. "His magical core is strong," she told Petunia quietly, while Harry examined the now perfect pencil with satisfaction. "Stronger than most children his age, which is not surprising given his parentage. But there are signs of suppression. Magical energy that's been forced down and contained rather than allowed to develop naturally. Is that bad? It could have been very bad if it had continued much longer. Magical children who are prevented from expressing their abilities often develop serious problems, emotional instability, accidental outbursts of uncontrolled power, even physical illness. Harry appears to have escaped the worst of it, but he needs proper guidance and a safe environment where he can learn to use his gifts appropriately. I don't know how to give him that." "No," Professor McGonagall agreed, "but I know people who do." An hour later, they were walking through the streets of London toward a destination that Professor McGonagall had described only as somewhere safe. Harry had fallen asleep against Petunia's shoulder, exhausted by the day's events, and lulled by the rhythmic sound of her footsteps on pavement. Professor McGonagall walked beside them in comfortable silence, occasionally touching her wand to street lamps they passed, though Petunia couldn't see any obvious effect. "There," Professor McGonagall said finally, stopping in front of what appeared to be a gap between two shops. "The leaky cauldron." As she spoke, the gap shimmered and revealed itself to be a doorway leading into a dark, cozy pub filled with people in robes and pointed hats. The transition was so sudden and startling that Petunia nearly stumbled, but Professor McGonagall steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Welcome to Diagon Alley, Mrs. Dursley," she said. "I think you'll find it quite different from Surrey." They passed through the pub, where several patrons nodded respectfully to Professor McGonagall and looked at Harry with expressions ranging from curiosity to something approaching reverence, and into a brick courtyard behind the building. Professor McGonagall tapped her wand against the wall in a complicated pattern, and the bricks rearranged themselves into an archway that revealed the most extraordinary street Petunia had ever seen. Diagon Alley bustled with activity, even in the early evening, full of shops selling things that defied explanation, and people who moved with the casual confidence of those who took magic for granted. Harry stirred in her arms, blinking sleepily at the sight of cauldrons and broomsticks, and bottles full of things that glowed and bubbled, and occasionally seemed to wave back at him. "It's beautiful," he whispered, and Petunia found herself agreeing. Professor McGonagall led them to a cheerful ice cream parlor called Florian Fortescue's, where she spoke quietly with a plump, kindly-looking man who kept glancing at Harry with the same reverent expression they'd encountered in the pub. Within minutes, arrangements had been made for them to stay in the small flat above the shop, complete with meals and anything else they might need. "Florian is an old friend," Professor McGonagall explained as they climbed the narrow stairs to their temporary home. "He's also discretion personified. You'll be safe here while we determine the best long-term arrangements for Harry's care and education." The flat was small but comfortable, with a sitting room, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom, with 2 beds covered in quilts that looked handmade. Harry explored with the cautious wonder of a child who'd never been allowed to touch anything valuable, running his fingers over books and ornaments with careful reverence. "Is this really for us?" he asked, stopping in front of a window that looked out over the magical street below. For as long as you need it, Professor McGonagall assured him. Mr. Fortescue will bring your meals, and there are books here suitable for a boy your age. Some of them even have moving pictures. Moving pictures? Professor McGonagall smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Petunia had seen from her. I think you'll find the magical world has many surprises for you, Harry. Good ones, this time. That night, Petunia sat by Harry's bed and watched him sleep more peacefully than she'd seen him rest in months. Outside their window, Diagon Alley settled into evening quiet, marked by the soft glow of magical street lamps and the distant sound of laughter from the pub below. For the first time since she'd packed their suitcase and fled Surrey, she felt something like hope settling in her chest. Harry was safe. More than safe. He was somewhere he could be himself, without fear or shame. Somewhere people looked at him and saw potential rather than problems. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she married Vernon and chose the path of determined normalcy. It wasn't the future she'd imagined when she'd rejected her sister's world so completely. But, watching Harry sleep with a smile on his face for the first time in years, Petunia thought it might be exactly the life they both needed. Chapter 4. Diagon Alley Mornings. October arrived in Diagon Alley with a crisp bite to the air that made the magical street lamps glow warmer and the shop windows shine brighter against the gathering dusk of shorter days. From her place behind the counter at Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor, Petunia watched the early morning crowd begin to gather. Witches and wizards heading to their jobs at the ministry, students from Hogwarts on a weekend visit, families with children who pressed their noses against shop windows and pointed at things that sparkled and moved and occasionally waved back. 3 months. It had been 3 months since Professor McGonagall had led them through the brick archway and into this impossible world. And some mornings, Petunia still felt like she was living in someone else's dream. Aunt Toonie, can I help with the sprinkles? Harry's voice carried from the back room where he was supposedly organizing napkins, but was more likely rearranging them into elaborate patterns. At 5 years old, he'd celebrated his birthday in July with more cake and presents than he'd ever seen in his life. He was still small for his age, but the sharpness was gone from his face. His cheeks had filled out with regular meals, and the absence of fear, and his eyes behind his glasses held a brightness that made Petunia's chest tight with gratitude every time she saw it. If you finished with the napkins, she called back, smiling at the enthusiasm in his voice. Everything was still an adventure to Harry. Every task in the shop, a game he was eager to master. Florian had taken to him immediately, teaching him the names of all 37 flavors and letting him help with simple tasks that made him glow with pride. Harry emerged from the back room carrying a tray of napkins arranged in perfect fan shapes, a level of care and attention that spoke of a child who'd learned to do things exactly right the first time, but who now applied that skill out of pride rather than fear of punishment. His hair was still an unruly mess that no amount of brushing could tame, but it was clean and healthy, and he'd grown enough that they'd had to buy him new clothes from Madame Malkin's. Clothes that fit, clothes that were his and no one else's. The first time he'd worn them, he'd spent 20 minutes staring at himself in the mirror, touching the fabric as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. Mrs. Larkin said she'll have the usual, Harry reported, settling the napkins in their designated spots with the careful precision he brought to everything, with extra chocolate sauce. And she asked me to tell you that little Timothy has been practicing his letters and can almost write his whole name now. Mrs. Larkin was one of their regular customers, a witch who worked at St. Mungo's and brought her 4-year-old son Timothy for ice cream every Saturday morning. She was also one of the growing number of magical parents who'd taken to chatting with Petunia about child-rearing, with a casual familiarity that still left her slightly breathless with surprise. In little whinging, she'd been the woman whose nephew was a bit odd, whose husband worked in drilling, and whose conversations never strayed beyond weather and local gossip. Here, she was Harry Potter's aunt, the Muggle woman who'd rescued the boy who lived, and was learning to navigate the magical world with determined grace. The transformation felt so complete sometimes that she barely recognized herself. "That's wonderful news about Timothy," Petunia said, beginning to prepare Mrs. Larkin's order. "Did she mention whether he's shown any signs yet?" Magic, she meant. It was the question all magical parents carried. When would their children first display the abilities that would mark them as part of this hidden world? Harry had been showing accidental magic since he was old enough to walk, but most magical children didn't manifest their abilities until they were closer to school age. "She thinks maybe," Harry said, settling onto the stool behind the counter that Florian had provided specifically for him. "She said he made his porridge ball spin in circles yesterday morning when he didn't want to eat it, but she's not sure if it was magic or if he just knocked it with his spoon." The casual way Harry discussed magic still amazed Petunia. Here, his abilities weren't something shameful to be hidden or frightening to be suppressed. They were simply part of who he was, as natural as his green eyes or his talent for arranging napkins in perfect patterns. Yesterday, she'd watched him help a little girl whose balloon had gotten stuck in the rafters by making it float gently down to her waiting hands. And both children had laughed with pure delight at the magic of it. The morning rush brought its usual mix of customers: ministry workers grabbing quick breakfast sundaes, Hogwarts students savoring weekend freedom, families with children who pressed sticky hands against the glass displays and debated the merits of chocolate fudge versus strawberry surprise. Petunia had learned to recognize the regulars, to remember their preferences, and ask after their families in ways that would have felt forced in her old life, but came naturally here. "Oh my goodness, is that Harry Potter?" The voice belonged to a young witch Petunia didn't recognize, probably in her early 20s, with bright pink hair that seemed to shift colors as she moved, and robes that sparkled with what looked like real diamonds. She was staring at Harry with the expression of someone who'd just spotted a celebrity, her eyes wide with awe and excitement. This was the part of their new life that Petunia struggled with most. Harry wasn't just Harry here. He was the boy who lived, the child who'd defeated the darkest wizard in generations, the famous orphan whose story was apparently taught to magical children alongside their ABCs. The attention made her uncomfortable and seemed to bewilder Harry, who couldn't understand why strangers wanted to shake his hand and tell him how brave he was for something he couldn't remember doing. "Yes," Petunia said carefully, moving protectively closer to where Harry was helping organize the cone display. "Can I help you with something?" "I just wanted to say thank you," the young witch said, her voice earnest and intense. "My older brother was an Auror. That's like a magical policeman," she added, apparently realizing that Petunia might not know. "He was killed fighting Death Eaters the month before you-know-who fell. If it weren't for Harry..." She trailed off, tears gathering in her eyes, and Petunia felt the familiar squeeze of something complicated in her chest. These moments happened regularly. People approaching to share stories about how Voldemort's defeat had saved their families, their children, their lives. It was humbling and overwhelming and deeply uncomfortable, because Harry had been 15 months old when whatever had happened at Godric's Hollow took place. He'd been a baby who'd lost his parents, not a hero who'd chosen to sacrifice himself for others. "Harry's just a little boy," Petunia said gently. "He's very glad that your family is safe, but he doesn't really understand." "Of course not," the young witch said quickly. "I didn't mean to make him uncomfortable. I wanted you to know that there are people who are grateful for what he did and for what you're doing now." The phrase stuck with Petunia as the witch brought her ice cream and left with a final, reverent glance at Harry. What was she doing exactly? Learning to scoop ice cream and remember the difference between butterbeer blast and pumpkin pasty swirl, trying to understand a world where photographs moved and books read themselves and children could make flowers bloom with their bare hands. She seemed nice, Harry said, apparently untroubled by the interaction. At 5, he was beginning to understand that people knew his name and his story, but he treated the attention with the same matter-of-fact acceptance he brought to everything else in his life. "Do you think her brother would have liked ice cream?" "I'm sure he would have," Petunia said, throat tight with affection for this child who responded to stories of war and death by wondering if the victims would have enjoyed dessert. The afternoon brought a birthday party, 6 magical children celebrating a 7-year-old's special day, with ice cream sundaes that changed flavors with every bite and sparklers that wrote words in the air. Harry watched from behind the counter with undisguised longing as the children laughed and played magical games that involved making their spoons dance and their napkins fold themselves into paper airplanes. "Would you like to join them?" Petunia asked quietly. The birthday girl's mother had already extended the invitation, mentioning casually that there was always room for one more child at a magical party. Harry shook his head, but she could see the conflict in his expression. "I'm helping you," he said firmly. "Florian needs us to keep the shop running." It was a 5-year-old's version of duty, and it broke her heart a little. Harry had spent so many years being excluded from celebrations that he couldn't quite believe invitations were genuine, even when extended by people who clearly delighted in his company. He was learning to trust kindness, but slowly, carefully, like someone touching a stove they expected to burn them. "I think we can spare one helper for half an hour," she said, untying his small apron. "Go play, sweetheart. The ice cream will still be here when you get back." Watching Harry join the other children felt like witnessing a small miracle. Within minutes, he was laughing as his ice cream spoon sprouted tiny wings and flew circles around his head. Accidental magic brought on by happiness rather than fear. The other children clapped and cheered, and the birthday girl's mother looked at Petunia with the warm approval of one parent recognizing another's success. "He's a lovely boy," Mrs. Clearwater said, settling beside Petunia to watch the festivities. "You've done wonderful work with him. I remember how thin and quiet he was when you first arrived. He just needed time," Petunia said, though she knew it had been more than that. Harry had needed safety, consistency, and adults who looked at him with affection instead of resentment. He'd needed a world where his differences were gifts rather than problems. Still, it takes wisdom to know how to help a traumatized child heal. Not everyone would have made the choices you did. The compliment settled warm in Petunia's chest. In little whinging, her parenting had been judged by how well she maintained appearances, whether Harry was clean and quiet and invisible enough not to reflect poorly on the family. Here, people seemed to care about whether he was happy, healthy, and developing into the person he was meant to become. It was nearly closing time when Vernon arrived. Petunia saw him through the shop window first, a familiar bulk in an ill-fitting suit, standing on the cobblestones of Diagon Alley and looking around with the aggressive bewilderment of someone who'd found themselves in hostile territory. His face was red with exertion and anger, and he was gripping a folded piece of paper that looked like it might have contained directions. Her stomach dropped to somewhere around her shoes. "Harry," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off her husband's approaching figure. "Go upstairs, please. But we haven't finished cleaning the—" "Now, Harry, please." Something in her voice must have communicated urgency, because Harry slipped off his stool and headed for the stairs without argument. He paused at the doorway, looking back with concern, but she gestured firmly for him to continue. Vernon pushed through the shop door with enough force to make the bell above it ring like an alarm. Up close, he looked worse than she'd expected. His face was flushed and sweaty, his hair disheveled, and his small eyes were bright with the kind of rage she remembered from their worst fights. He'd clearly spent considerable effort tracking them down, and the delay had only fed his anger. "There you are," he said loudly enough to make the few remaining customers look up from their ice cream. "Do you have any idea what kind of hell you've put me through? Disappearing in the middle of the night with that boy, making me look like some sort of monster to the neighbors." "Vernon." She kept her voice level, professional, as if he were just another customer she needed to handle diplomatically. "You need to leave. Leave." His laugh was harsh and ugly. "I'm not going anywhere without my wife and that boy. This little holiday of yours is over, Petunia. You're coming home where you belong." "No," she said simply. "I'm not." The word hung in the air between them, solid and immovable. Vernon stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and mounting fury. "You can't be serious. You can't actually want to stay in this freak show." He gestured around the shop with disgust, taking in the magical photographs on the walls and the ice cream flavors that occasionally changed colors on their own. "This isn't real life, Petunia. This is make-believe nonsense, and I won't have my wife playing house with freaks and weirdos." "Your wife?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "When exactly did you start thinking of me as your wife again?" "Because I remember mostly being your housekeeper who happened to share your bed." Vernon's face went darker. "Don't you dare try to turn this around on me. I provided for you. I gave you a good home, a respectable life. You gave Harry a cupboard and a childhood full of fear. That thing is not my responsibility. That thing is my nephew, and his name is Harry. His name is Freak, and he belongs in an institution where he can't hurt normal people with his unnatural tricks." The last words were shouted loud enough to carry through the shop and onto the street beyond. Several passers-by had stopped to watch through the windows, their expressions ranging from curiosity to alarm. Petunia was dimly aware that this was exactly the kind of scene that would be talked about in Diagon Alley for weeks, but she found she didn't care. "Get out," she said quietly. "Get out now, or I'll call for help." "Call for help?" Vernon laughed again. "Who's going to help you in this ridiculous place? More freaks? More people who think children should be encouraged to break the laws of nature?" "Actually," said a new voice from the doorway, "I rather think quite a few people would be happy to help." The man who'd spoken was tall and official-looking, wearing deep blue robes with a silver badge pinned to his chest. Behind him stood two more similarly dressed figures, their wands held casually but visibly in their hands. Ministry officials, Petunia realized. Magical law enforcement who'd apparently been summoned by the commotion. "Vernon Dursley," the first man said pleasantly. "I'm Auror Williams with the Ministry of Magic. We've had reports of threatening behavior toward a magical child. Would you care to explain yourself?" Vernon's face went through several interesting color changes. "You have no authority over me," he blustered. "I'm not one of your kind. I don't follow your laws." "Actually, Mr. Dursley, when you enter magical territory and threaten magical citizens, you very much do fall under our jurisdiction." "And making threats against Harry Potter specifically." Auror Williams shook his head with mock sadness. "Well, that's taken quite seriously indeed." "This is insane," Vernon said. But some of the bluster was leaving his voice. The sight of 3 armed wizards seemed to be penetrating even his thick skull. He's my wife's nephew. I have rights. You have the right to leave quietly. Another Auror said firmly. You have the right to avoid making any further threats against magical citizens. You do not have the right to harass a woman who's made it clear she doesn't wish to see you. Vernon looked around the shop, as if searching for support, but found only unfriendly faces and carefully neutral expressions. Whatever sympathy he might have expected for a man trying to reclaim his wife was clearly not forthcoming in a place where people had heard him call a 5-year-old boy a freak and demand his institutionalization. This isn't over, he said finally, looking directly at Petunia with eyes full of cold anger. You can't hide behind freaks forever. Sooner or later, you're going to have to come back to the real world. Dursley, Auror Williams said conversationally. Are you familiar with the Statute of Secrecy? The what? Violation of that statute. Say, by a muggle who threatens to expose magical citizens or their activities, is a serious crime, one that can result in memory modification and other unpleasant consequences. Vernon's face went pale. You can't, and we will, if we hear that you've been discussing your visit here with anyone outside the shop. Are we understood? For a moment, Petunia thought Vernon might try to argue further, but whatever else he was, her husband wasn't stupid enough to threaten armed government officials in front of witnesses. He gave her one last look full of frustrated rage, then turned and stalked out of the shop without another word. The Aurors followed him to ensure he actually left Diagon Alley. And Petunia found herself alone in the sudden quiet of her ice cream shop, surrounded by melting displays and the lingering echo of raised voices. Aunt Toonie. Harry's voice came from the stairs, small and uncertain. Is Uncle Vernon gone? Yes, sweetheart, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. He's gone. Harry came down the stairs slowly, his eyes wide behind his glasses. He was very angry, he observed. Yes, he was. Are you sad that he came? Petunia considered the question seriously. Was she sad? Or was she something else entirely? Relieved, perhaps, that the confrontation was finally over, and Vernon had been revealed for exactly what he was, in front of witnesses who wouldn't dismiss or excuse his behavior. No, she said finally. I'm not sad. I'm proud of us for standing up to him. Harry nodded solemnly, then surprised her by wrapping his thin arms around her waist in a fierce hug. I love you, Aunt Toonie, he said, his voice muffled against her apron. I'm glad we live here now. I love you too, sweetheart, she said, holding him close and meaning it more than she'd ever meant anything in her life. And I'm glad we live here too. Outside, Diagon Alley was settling into evening, the magical street lamps beginning to glow against the October darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new customers, new opportunities for Harry to grow and learn, and become the remarkable person she could already see he was meant to be. But tonight, they were safe, they were together, and they were exactly where they belonged. Chapter 5. The Howler from Surrey. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, delivered by the regular Muggle post, alongside bills and advertisements that seemed absurdly mundane in the magical setting of Diagon Alley. Petunia recognized Vernon's heavy handwriting immediately, the aggressive slashes and cramped letters that had once been as familiar to her as her own breathing. She stood in the tiny kitchen above Florian's shop, holding the envelope and feeling her stomach clench with a dread she'd hoped never to experience again. Harry was downstairs helping Florian prepare for the morning rush, his voice carrying faintly through the floorboards as he chatted about the new flavor they were testing, peppermint surprise, which allegedly changed from mint to chocolate to strawberry with each lick. At 5 years old, he approached each day with an enthusiasm that still caught her off guard. as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune would last, but was determined to enjoy every moment while it did. She opened Vernon's letter with hands that trembled only slightly. Petunia, this nonsense has gone on long enough. I've given you time to come to your senses, but clearly you're not thinking rationally. That boy has obviously addled your brain with his freakish influence, just like his mother did to our family all those years ago. You will return home immediately with the boy. I've told the neighbors you've been visiting a sick relative, but people are starting to ask questions. Dudley is asking for his mother, and I won't have my son suffering because you've decided to play house with freaks. If you're not back by December 1st, I'll be forced to take legal action to protect my family and my marriage. Don't think I won't do it. Vernon. The letter was exactly what she'd expected, demanding, threatening, and completely oblivious to any perspective except Vernon's own. What surprised her was how little it affected her a year ago. A letter like this would have sent her into spirals of anxiety and guilt, wondering if perhaps Vernon was right and she was being selfish and unreasonable. Now, after months of watching Harry bloom in an environment free from Vernon's casual cruelty, it simply made her angry. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the drawer where she kept their important documents. Harry's birth certificate, the custody arrangements Professor McGonagall had helped her establish, the official magical papers that granted them residency in Diagon Alley. Vernon's threats would need to be taken seriously, but they were no longer the devastating pronouncements of an authority figure she couldn't challenge. The second letter arrived the following Monday, and then another on Wednesday. Each one escalated the demands and threats, moving from appeals to her duty as a wife, to ultimatums about proper custody arrangements, to barely veiled promises of legal action that would tear Harry away from the only stability he'd ever known. It was the fourth letter, arriving on a grey December morning, that made Harry wake up screaming. Petunia found him sitting bolt upright in bed, his small body shaking and his face pale with terror behind his askew glasses. The window in their bedroom had a crack running from corner to corner, and the water glass on his nightstand had shattered so completely the tiny pieces of glass glittered across the floor like scattered stars. He was here, Harry gasped, reaching for her with desperate hands. Uncle Vernon was here, and he was shouting, and he said I had to go back to the cupboard and I couldn't breathe. Just a dream, sweetheart, Petunia murmured, pulling him into her arms and holding him tight. Just a dream. Uncle Vernon isn't here. You're safe. But even as she spoke, she could hear movement downstairs, voices raised in concern, the sound of something falling and breaking. Harry's nightmare had triggered the kind of violent magical outburst that could affect an entire building. And she realized with growing dread that this was only the beginning. The episodes began happening nightly. Harry would fall asleep peacefully enough, exhausted from his days helping in the shop and playing with the other magical children who lived in Diagon Alley. But sometime between midnight and dawn, his dreams would turn dark, and his terror would manifest in bursts of accidental magic that rattled windows, shattered glass, and once, memorably, made every door in the building slam open and closed for nearly 10 minutes. The other residents were understanding. Magical children experiencing trauma-induced magical outbursts were apparently not uncommon. But the disruption was becoming impossible to ignore. Petunia found herself walking on eggshells, afraid that any mention of Vernon or hint of stress would trigger another episode that left Harry exhausted and ashamed of his inability to control his abilities. It's not his fault, Professor McGonagall assured her during one of their weekly check-ins. They were sitting in the small parlor above the shop, while Harry napped fitfully in the bedroom, recovering from a particularly bad night that had left scorch marks on the walls, and turned all the milk in Florian's shop sour. Magical children who've experienced trauma often struggle with control when they're reminded of their abusers. Harry's subconscious is trying to protect him from a threat it perceives as real. The letters, Petunia said quietly. He doesn't know about the letters, but somehow he knows Vernon is pressing, threatening us. Children are remarkably perceptive, especially magical ones. Harry can sense your stress, even when you try to hide it from him. Petunia stared at the latest letter from Vernon, which had arrived that morning with its familiar blend of emotional manipulation and legal threats. This one had been different, written on official letterhead from a solicitor's office, full of formal language about parental rights and appropriate custody arrangements and the welfare of the minor child. "He's hired a lawyer," she said. "I rather suspected he might. Men like your husband don't give up easily when they feel their authority has been challenged. What am I supposed to do? I have no money of my own, no legal standing. Vernon is still my husband." And legally, she trailed off, unwilling to voice the fear that had been growing in her chest. Legally, Vernon had rights. Legally, she was a wife who had abandoned her home and taken a child who wasn't technically hers. Professor McGonagall was quiet for a moment, her sharp eyes focused on something beyond the parlor windows. When she spoke, her voice was measured and careful. "Mrs. Dursley, are you familiar with the concept of magical guardianship?" "No." "In the magical world, the welfare of magical children supersedes many of the legal structures that govern Muggle society. A magical child who is being harmed or neglected can be removed from their guardians and placed with someone better suited to their care, regardless of blood relations or legal paperwork." Petunia felt her heart skip a beat. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that Harry Potter is not just any magical child. He is the boy who lived, and the magical community has a vested interest in ensuring his safety and proper development. If you were to petition for magical guardianship, with the appropriate documentation of Mr. Dursley's treatment of Harry, I believe you would find the Wisengamot quite sympathetic to your case." The Wisengamot. Petunia had learned enough about magical society to know that was their equivalent of Parliament and Supreme Court combined, the governing body that made laws and settled disputes in the magical world. The thought of appealing to them directly was both terrifying and exhilarating. Would they have jurisdiction? If Vernon challenges me in Muggle courts, Harry is a magical child, which makes him subject to magical law. More importantly, there are protections in place that ensure his welfare is prioritized above all other considerations. Protections that were established the night his parents died. There was something in Professor McGonagall's voice that suggested depths of information she wasn't sharing, legal complexities that went beyond what Petunia needed to understand. But the core message was clear. Harry's status in the magical world gave him protections that Vernon couldn't challenge, no matter how many Muggle solicitors he hired. How would I begin? The petition, I mean. I know someone who can help. The someone turned out to be Andromeda Tonks, a witch in her 40s, with kind eyes and steel-grey hair, who specialized in magical family law. She arrived at their flat on a snowy December afternoon, carrying a leather briefcase and an air of competent authority that reminded Petunia strongly of Professor McGonagall herself. "Mrs. Dursley," she said, settling into their small sitting room with practiced ease. "Professor McGonagall has told me about your situation. I understand you need help securing permanent custody of Harry Potter." "Yes." The word came out smaller than Petunia intended. "My husband he's threatening to take Harry back. He's hired lawyers, and I don't know how to fight someone with resources when I have none." Mrs. Tonks opened her briefcase and withdrew a stack of official-looking documents. "Actually, Mrs. Dursley, you have more resources than you might think. Harry Potter's magical guardianship comes with certain benefits: legal aid if needed, housing assistance, educational support. The magical community takes care of its own, especially when those individuals are as significant as Harry. I don't want charity. This isn't charity. This is recognition that you've done what few people would have the courage to do. You've put a child's welfare above your own security and comfort. You've already proven yourself to be the kind of guardian Harry needs. Over the next hour, Mrs. Tonks walked her through the process of petitioning for formal magical guardianship. It was surprisingly straightforward. A series of forms documenting Harry's treatment under Vernon's care, statements from magical authorities who had observed Harry's improvement under Petunia's guardianship, and testimony about Vernon's threats and attempts to reclaim custody. The hearing will be before a panel of Wizengamot members who specialize in child welfare cases, Mrs. Tonks explained. They'll want to interview Harry, gently and with appropriate protections, and they'll review all the evidence of his treatment and current circumstances. And if they rule in my favor, then you become Harry's legal magical guardian with all the rights and protections that entails. Mr. Dursley's Muggle legal challenges become irrelevant. Magical law supersedes Muggle law in cases involving magical children. That night, as Harry slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, Petunia sat at their small kitchen table and filled out the petition forms. Each question felt like a step towards something that had seemed impossible just months ago. A future where she and Harry were safe, not because they were hiding, but because they had legal protection and official recognition of their bond. State your relationship to the child in question. Aunt by blood, she wrote. Guardian by choice. Describe the child's current living situation. Safe, loved, free to be exactly who he is meant to be. List your reasons for seeking guardianship. The pen hovered over the paper as she considered how to capture everything in the small space provided. How could she explain the transformation she'd witnessed in Harry? How could she describe the way his nightmares had faded as he learned to trust that kindness wouldn't be followed by punishment? How could she convey the bone-deep certainty that this child was exactly where he belonged? In the end, she wrote simply, because he deserves a family who loves him. The petition was filed 3 days before Christmas, carried by official ministry howl to the Wizengamot offices and stamped with seals and signatures that made it officially part of the magical legal record. Within a week, they received notice that a hearing had been scheduled for the second week of January, enough time for Vernon to be officially notified and mount whatever challenge he chose. But soon enough that Harry's situation wouldn't remain in limbo indefinitely. Are you nervous? Harry asked on Christmas Eve, looking up from the magical storybook Mrs. Clearwater had given him. The pictures moved and changed as he read, acting out the adventures of a young wizard who discovered he could talk to dragons. A little, Petunia admitted. They were sitting in front of the small fireplace in their flat, sharing hot chocolate, while snow fell softly outside their windows. Diagon Alley was decorated for the holidays, with lights that changed colors and garlands that occasionally burst into song. And Harry had spent the afternoon watching the decorations with the wonder of a child who was still learning that magic could be beautiful, instead of frightening. I'm not nervous, Harry said confidently. I know we belong together. The magic knows it too. How can you tell? Harry considered this seriously, in the way 5-year-olds approached questions that adults found complex. It feels right, he said finally, like how it feels right when you hug me, or when we make ice cream together, or when you read me stories. The magic likes it when things feel right. Looking at him, healthy and happy, and absolutely certain of his place in the world. Petunia felt some of her anxiety ease. Harry was right. Whatever challenges Vernon might mount, whatever legal complexities they might face, the simple truth was that they belonged together. She'd chosen him, and he'd chosen her, and all the solicitors and threatening letters in the world couldn't change that fundamental bond. "I love you, sweetheart," she said, pulling him close. "I love you too, Aunt Toonie, forever and always." Outside, Diagon Alley settled into Christmas Eve quiet, and inside their small flat, Petunia held her nephew close and prepared to fight for their right to be a family. Chapter 6. The Custody Hearing. The courtroom was unlike anything Petunia had ever seen, a peculiar hybrid of Muggle legal tradition and magical innovation that seemed to exist in the space between two worlds. Located in the basement levels of the Ministry of Magic, it had been specially designed to accommodate proceedings that involved both magical and non-magical parties. Half the chamber featured the familiar wooden benches and formal atmosphere of a traditional British courtroom, while the other half contained the raised stone seats and ancient dignity of the Wizengamot chambers. Petunia sat in the front row of the Muggle section, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their trembling. Beside her, Andromeda Tonks reviewed her notes one final time, her expression calm and professional, despite the significance of what they were about to attempt. This was the first time in recent memory that a custody case involving a magical child had required a joint hearing between both legal systems, and the precedent they set today would affect how similar cases were handled for years to come. "Remember," Mrs. Tonks murmured quietly, "answer only what is asked. Be honest but concise, and don't let Mr. Dursley's solicitor intimidate you. Everything you've told me is well documented and provable." Harry sat between Petunia and Professor McGonagall, wearing his best clothes and looking smaller than his 5 years in the vast formal chamber. He'd been briefed on what to expect, that there would be lots of adults asking questions, that some of them might not understand about magic, and that he should tell the truth, but stay close to Aunt Toonie. His small hand was warm in hers, and she drew strength from his calm presence. "Will Uncle Vernon be very angry?" he'd asked that morning over breakfast, his green eyes serious behind his glasses. "Probably," she'd admitted. "But remember what we talked about. His anger isn't your fault, and it can't hurt you anymore. We have lots of people here to protect us." The door at the back of the chamber opened with a sound like thunder, and Vernon entered with his legal entourage. He'd clearly spared no expense. His solicitor was an expensive-looking man in an even more expensive suit, and he'd brought character witnesses in the form of his parents and, heartbreakingly, Dudley. Dudley looked overwhelmed by the formal atmosphere, clinging to his grandmother's hand and staring around the chamber with wide, confused eyes. At 5.5 years old, he was noticeably larger than Harry, despite being only a few months older, his round face flushed with nervousness. When his gaze fell on Harry, his expression shifted to something that might have been recognition, or might have been bewilderment. It had been 7 months since they'd seen each other, and both boys had changed considerably. Vernon, however, looked exactly the same, red-faced, aggressive, and radiating the righteous anger of a man who believed the entire world was conspiring against him. When his small eyes found Petunia across the courtroom, his expression darkened with barely controlled fury. "All rise for the Honourable Justice Pemberton and the Wizengamot Council," announced the court clerk, and the chamber rose as one. Justice Pemberton was a thin, distinguished man in traditional judicial robes, who took his seat on the Muggle side of the bench, while 3 witches and wizards in deep purple robes settled into the elevated Wizengamot seats. The symbolism was clear. Both legal systems would have equal voice in determining Harry's future. This is a joint hearing to determine the custody and guardianship of one Harry James Potter. Justice Pemberton began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. The petitioner, Mrs. Petunia Dursley, seeks to formalize her guardianship of the minor child. The respondent, Mr. Vernon Dursley, contests this petition and seeks to regain custody. Due to the unique circumstances involving a magical child, this proceeding will be conducted under the joint authority of Her Majesty's Family Court and the Wizengamot Council. Vernon's solicitor rose first, a sharp-faced man named Fitzwilliam, who spoke with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to winning through intimidation rather than merit. His opening statement painted Petunia as an unstable woman who had abandoned her family responsibilities and endangered a vulnerable child by exposing him to unnatural influences and dangerous individuals. "My client seeks only to protect his family," Fitzwilliam declared, gesturing toward Vernon with practiced sympathy. "Mr. Dursley has provided a stable, loving home for this child since infancy, only to have his wife abduct the boy and disappear without explanation. The so-called evidence of mistreatment consists entirely of unsubstantiated allegations made by a woman who has clearly been influenced by individuals with their own agenda regarding this child. It was masterfully done, reasonable sounding, and designed to appeal to conventional assumptions about family stability and maternal hysteria." Petunia felt her stomach clench as she watched the Muggle officials nodding along with the familiar narrative. Mrs. Tonks's response was quieter, but more devastating. Rising from her seat with deliberate grace, she addressed both sides of the chamber equally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for children who couldn't fight for themselves. "My lords and ladies," she began, "this case is not about competing claims to property. It is about the welfare of a 5-year-old child who has endured years of systematic abuse and neglect, and who has only recently begun to heal from trauma that should never have been inflicted on any child, magical or otherwise." She gestured toward a stack of documents that seemed to materialize on the judges' benches. "The evidence of Harry Potter's mistreatment is not unsubstantiated allegations. It is extensive medical and magical documentation compiled by qualified professionals who have observed this child's condition and progress over the past 7 months." The hearing proceeded with the methodical thoroughness of formal legal proceedings. Vernon's witnesses testified first, his parents, painting him as a devoted father and responsible husband, Fitzwilliam presenting financial records that showed Vernon's ability to provide material support. Dudley was called forward briefly, more as visual evidence of Vernon's parenting than as an actual witness, though his obvious confusion about why they were all in a courtroom spoke volumes about what he'd been told about the proceedings. "Tell us about Harry," one of the Wizengamot members prompted gently when Dudley seemed paralyzed by the formal atmosphere. "Harry's my cousin," Dudley said in a small voice, looking around the chamber with wide eyes. "He used to live in the cupboard, but then Aunt Petunia took him away, and Daddy said he was bad and we couldn't see him anymore." The absolute innocence of the statement, delivered without malice or understanding of its implications, created a moment of electric silence in the chamber. Even Vernon's solicitor looked momentarily nonplussed. "The cupboard?" Justice Pemberton asked carefully. "Under the stairs," Dudley clarified helpfully. "Harry's bed was there because Daddy said freaks don't get proper rooms." Vernon's face went purple. "He doesn't understand." "Dursley," Justice Pemberton said sharply, "you'll have your opportunity to respond. Please continue, young man." But Dudley had apparently said all he intended to say and was dismissed to sit with his grandparents while the hearing continued. The damage, however, was done. Dudley's guileless testimony had undermined hours of careful character building more effectively than any cross-examination could have. When Vernon himself took the stand, his performance was exactly what Petunia had expected: aggressive, self-righteous, and utterly convinced of his own victimization. He spoke at length about his responsibilities as a provider, his efforts to give the boy a normal upbringing, and his wife's inexplicable decision to abandon her family for the influence of dangerous elements who had clearly corrupted her judgment. "That boy is not natural," Vernon declared, his voice rising as his prepared statements gave way to genuine anger. "He breaks things just by looking at them. He makes impossible things happen when he's upset. My wife calls it magic, but I call it dangerous. Normal children don't need to be kept away from anything breakable or valuable. Normal children don't need special schools, or special treatment, or special considerations. That boy needs help, professional help, not encouragement to believe his problems are somehow special gifts." "And what kind of help do you believe Harry needs?" asked one of the Wesengamot members, her voice carefully neutral. "Institutional care," Vernon said without hesitation. "Somewhere they understand children with problems. Somewhere they can teach him to control his unnatural impulses before he hurts someone." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Petunia felt Harry's small body tense beside her, and she squeezed his hand reassuringly while trying to control her own surge of rage. This was Vernon at his most honest, not pretending to love Harry or even care for his welfare, but openly advocating for his institutionalization because his magical nature was inconvenient. When Petunia took the stand, her voice shook for the first few questions, but grew steadier as she began to describe the realities of Harry's life on Privet Drive. She spoke about the cupboard, about meals withheld as punishment, about the constant message that Harry was unwanted and unnatural. She described Vernon's escalating anger whenever Harry displayed accidental magic, and his threats to beat the freakishness out of him if other methods failed to suppress his abilities. "Mrs. Dursley," Vernon's solicitor said during cross-examination, his tone suggesting polite concern over obvious mental instability, "are you seriously asking this court to believe that a responsible adult would confine a child to a cupboard?" "I'm not asking you to believe anything," Petunia replied steadily. "I'm telling you what happened. Harry lived in the cupboard under the stairs from the time he was old enough to sleep alone until the day I took him away. There are photographs if you need proof. I documented his living conditions before we left. The photographs were, indeed, devastating. Images of a space barely large enough for a small child to lie down, containing a thin mattress, a few ragged toys, and bars across the small window that turned it into something resembling a prison cell, more than a bedroom." "And you allowed this?" the solicitor pressed. "Yes." The word came out as barely a whisper. "To my eternal shame, I allowed it. I told myself it was temporary, that Vernon would come around, that Harry would learn to be less magical if we were firm enough. I was wrong about everything, but especially about what Harry needed from the adults who were supposed to protect him." Her voice broke as she continued. "Harry needed people who looked at him and saw a child to be loved, not a problem to be solved. He needed adults who celebrated his gifts instead of punishing him for them. He needed a home where he could be safe and happy and exactly who he was meant to be. I couldn't give him any of those things as long as I stayed with my husband." It was in that moment, as Petunia testified about Harry's transformation since leaving Privet Drive, that the magical testimony began. Harry had been sitting quietly throughout the proceedings, occasionally leaning against Professor McGonagall's side when the testimony became particularly upsetting. But, as Petunia described finding him crying in the cupboard after Dudley's birthday party, the moment she'd finally realized what kind of person she'd become. Something shifted in the chamber's atmosphere. The air began to shimmer with soft golden light, emanating from where Harry sat and spreading outward like gentle waves. It wasn't threatening or chaotic like his nightmare-induced outbursts. This was warm, comforting, and somehow conveying emotions that words couldn't capture. The Muggle officials stared in amazement as the light danced around the chamber, and even Vernon fell silent in the face of something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. "Extraordinary," breathed Justice Pemberton, staring at Harry as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Professor McGonagall rose from her seat with quiet dignity. "If I may address the court," she asked, and at Justice Pemberton's nod, she stepped forward into the space between the two sections of the chamber. "What you're witnessing is called emotional resonance magic. It occurs when a magical child feels particularly safe and loved. It's extremely rare and speaks to both the strength of Harry's natural abilities and the depth of his bond with Mrs. Dursley." "This child is Harry Potter?" asked one of the Muggle officials, and when Professor McGonagall nodded, he continued, "The boy who defeated you-know-who. The boy who survived the killing curse. Yes. At 15 months old, Harry Potter faced the darkest wizard in generations and lived to tell about it. He is quite literally the most famous magical child alive, and the entire wizarding world has a vested interest in his welfare and proper development." The weight of this revelation settled over the Muggle side of the chamber like a physical force. These were officials accustomed to routine custody disputes over ordinary children. Suddenly, they were being asked to make decisions about someone who was apparently a living legend in a world they were only beginning to understand existed. "Magic is real," Justice Pemberton said slowly, as if testing the words. "And this child is perhaps the most important magical child of his generation," Professor McGonagall confirmed. "He needs guidance, education, and protection that can only be provided by people who understand both his significance and his humanity. Mrs. Dursley has proven herself capable of providing exactly that kind of care." The testimony that followed painted a comprehensive picture of Harry's progress under Petunia's guardianship. Mrs. Clearwater spoke about his social development and growing confidence around other children. Florian Fortescue testified about Harry's helpful nature and obvious happiness in his daily routine. Andromeda Tonks presented medical documentation showing his improved health, weight gain, and decreased anxiety markers. Most powerfully, Professor McGonagall described the magical assessment she'd conducted when Harry first arrived in Diagon Alley. The signs of magical suppression, the trauma-induced behavioral patterns, and the remarkable improvement that had occurred as he learned to trust that his abilities would be celebrated rather than punished. "In my 40 years of teaching magical children," Professor McGonagall concluded, "I have rarely seen a transformation as dramatic as Harry Potter's. The frightened, suppressed child Mrs. Dursley brought to me 7 months ago has become confident, curious, and secure in his identity as both a magical person and a beloved member of his family. That kind of healing requires extraordinary care and commitment." The deliberation took less than an hour. When the court reconvened, Justice Pemberton's expression was grave but determined. "This court has considered testimony from all parties regarding the welfare and custody of Harry Potter," he began. "The evidence presented demonstrates conclusively that this child suffered significant abuse and neglect while in the care of Mr. Vernon Dursley, and that his condition has improved dramatically under the guardianship of Mrs. Petunia Dursley." Vernon started to object, but Justice Pemberton continued without pause. "Furthermore, this court recognizes that Harry Potter is not an ordinary child, but rather an individual with extraordinary abilities and significance within the magical community. His needs cannot be met through conventional child-rearing approaches, and his guardians must be equipped to provide both understanding and proper guidance regarding his magical development. The judge looked directly at Petunia, his expression kind but serious. Mrs. Dursley, this court awards you full legal guardianship of Harry Potter, with all rights and responsibilities that entails. Mr. Dursley will be granted supervised visitation rights, to be exercised only under the oversight of qualified magical authorities, and only if such visits are deemed beneficial to the child's welfare. The relief that flooded through Petunia was so intense it left her lightheaded. Harry, seeming to sense that something important had happened, even if he didn't understand all the legal language, squeezed her hand and smiled up at her with absolute trust. As a final matter, Justice Pemberton added, "This court recommends that Mrs. Dursley and Harry Potter continue to reside within the magical community where appropriate support services and educational resources are available. The unique circumstances of this case require ongoing oversight from magical authorities to ensure the child's continued welfare and development." Vernon's face was a study in frustrated rage, but there was nothing more he could do. The court had spoken, both legal systems had agreed, and Harry was officially, legally, and permanently safe. As they left the courthouse, Harry skipping between Petunia and Professor McGonagall, with obvious relief that the serious adult business was finished. Petunia felt something like peace settle in her chest for the first time in months. "It's over," she said quietly to Mrs. Tonks. "The legal proceedings—" "Yes," Mrs. Tonks agreed. "But really, Mrs. Dursley, this is just the beginning. You and Harry have your whole future ahead of you now." Trusting face, as he chatted about whether they could stop for ice cream on the way home. Petunia thought that sounded absolutely perfect. Chapter 7. The Photograph in Flourish and Blots. Summer arrived in Diagon Alley with a warmth that seemed to make the very stones sing with contentment. The magical street had taken on the lazy, golden quality of long afternoons and extended daylight, where shop windows sparkled in the sun, and children could be heard laughing from the small park, tucked between Ollivanders and the magical menagerie. For Harry Potter, now 6 years old, and possessed of the endless curiosity that came with another year of growth and security, it was the most wonderful season he could remember. "Aunt Toonie, can we get the book about the dragon who learned to read?" Harry asked, pressing his nose against the window of Flourish and Blots with the intensity of someone who had discovered that books were not just words on a page, but doorways to infinite possibility. At 6, he was tall for his age and had finally grown into his glasses, though his hair remained as unruly as ever. More importantly, he had developed the vocabulary and confidence to ask for things he wanted, instead of simply hoping someone might notice his interest. "We can look at it," Petunia agreed, pushing open the door to the bookshop with the fond exasperation of an adult who had quickly learned that a magical child's appetite for stories was apparently boundless. "But remember what we talked about. We choose 2 books today, and we finish reading the ones at home before we get new ones." It was a rule that existed more in theory than practice. There, small flat above Florian's had gradually filled with picture books, storybooks, and educational texts, as Petunia discovered the peculiar joy of being able to say yes to a child's requests for learning materials. After years of watching Harry make do with Dudley's cast-off textbooks and broken toys, the simple act of buying him new books felt like a form of magic all its own. Flourish and Blots on a summer afternoon was a wonderland of literary possibility. The shop's enchanted shelves rearranged themselves based on customer preferences, so that children's books migrated towards small visitors, while serious academic texts arranged themselves at adult eye level. Harry had learned to navigate the shop's peculiar geography with the expertise of a regular customer, heading directly for the section where picture books told their stories with moving illustrations and occasionally offered commentary on their own plots. "Oh, look at this one," Harry said, settling cross-legged on the floor with a book about a young witch who befriended a family of garden gnomes. The gnomes are wearing little hats, and they change colors when they're happy or sad. Petunia settled beside him, enjoying the comfortable routine they'd developed around book shopping. Harry would read aloud, occasionally pausing to ask about words he didn't recognize or to comment on particularly interesting illustrations. It was one of her favorite parts of their week. These quiet moments where they could simply enjoy each other's company without the weight of their complicated past casting shadows over their happiness. "Aunt Toonie," Harry said after they'd made their way through several promising books. "What's that section over there? The one with all the newspapers?" Petunia looked where he was pointing and saw the Daily Prophet archive, rows of bound newspapers dating back decades, maintained for researchers and curious readers who wanted to study magical history. She'd noticed the section before, but had never felt moved to explore it. The present was complicated enough without delving into the past. "Those are old newspapers," she said, "like the Daily Mail or the Times, but for magical people. They keep copies so people can read about things that happened before they were born." Harry's face lit up with interest. At 6, he was beginning to understand that he had a history that preceded his life with Aunt Toonie, and that some of that history was apparently quite famous in the magical world. Other children his age spoke of him with a reverence that both pleased and puzzled him, referring to something important he'd done as a baby that he couldn't quite remember. "Could we look?" he asked. "Maybe there are stories about when I was little." The request was so innocent, so natural for a child beginning to wonder about his origins, that Petunia found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the implications. Of course, Harry would be curious about his past. Of course, he'd want to understand the events that had shaped his early life. She'd been dreading this moment for months, but perhaps it was better to face it in the controlled environment of a bookshop rather than waiting for him to stumble across information elsewhere. They made their way to the archive section, where a helpful shop assistant directed them to volumes from 1980 and 1981. Harry settled at a small table with the serious concentration he brought to anything involving reading, while Petunia watched him with growing anxiety. It was Harry who found the wedding announcement, tucked into a society page from the spring of 1981. The photograph showed Lily and James on their wedding day, Lily radiant in simple white robes, James grinning with the confident joy of a young man who believed the world held nothing but good things. The magical photograph moved in the gentle, repetitive way of all such images, showing the couple laughing together, James spinning Lily around, Lily reaching up to straighten his perpetually messy hair. "Is that my mummy and daddy?" Harry asked, his voice small with wonder. Petunia's throat closed. She'd seen this photograph before, of course. It had been prominently featured in the Prophet's coverage of the Potter wedding, and she'd stared at it with a mixture of love and resentment that had left her feeling sick for days. Lily looked so happy, so perfectly radiant, so completely at home in the magical world that had embraced her while rejecting her sister. "Yes," she managed. "That's them on their wedding day." Harry traced the edge of the photograph with careful fingers, his expression intense with concentration. "Mummy looks like me," he observed. "We have the same eyes. You do. And Daddy's hair is messy like mine. Very much like yours." Harry was quiet for several minutes, studying the photograph with the methodical attention he brought to particularly interesting puzzles. Finally, he looked up at Petunia with the direct gaze that always reminded her so powerfully of Lily. "Were you there?" he asked. "At the wedding?" The simple question hit her like a physical blow. She'd been dreading this moment for over a year now, the inevitable conversation about her relationship with Lily, out the years of silence and rejection that had preceded their deaths. How did one explain to a 6-year-old that his aunt had been too proud and too jealous to attend his parents' wedding? How did one admit to such fundamental failures of love and loyalty? "No," she said quietly. "I wasn't there." Why not? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Harry couldn't yet understand, but that weighed on Petunia like stones in her chest. Around them, the bookshop continued its gentle afternoon bustle. Other families browsing together, children discovering new stories, the comfortable sounds of a community at peace. But for Petunia, the world had narrowed to this moment, this question, and the truth she'd been avoiding for 6 years. "Because I was angry with your mother," she said finally. "And I was wrong to be angry. And I was wrong not to go. And I've regretted it every day since." Harry studied her face with the unnervingly perceptive gaze of a child who had learned to read adult emotions for signs of danger or displacement. What he saw there seemed to satisfy him that she was telling the truth, even if he didn't understand all the implications. "What were you angry about?" Petunia closed her eyes for a moment, gathering the courage for honesty that felt more difficult than any testimony she'd given in court. "I was angry because your mother could do magic, and I couldn't. I was angry because our parents were proud of her for being special, and I felt like they forgot about me. I was angry because she got to go to Hogwarts and make new friends and have adventures, while I stayed home and felt ordinary." "But ordinary isn't bad," Harry said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of someone who had spent his earliest years being told that ordinary was the highest aspiration he could hope for. Uncle Vernon said ordinary was good, and magic was bad, but he was wrong about everything. Uncle Vernon was wrong about many things, Petunia agreed. But I was wrong too. I let my jealousy make me mean to your mother when I should have been proud of her. I said things I didn't mean and did things I can't take back. And when she died, her voice broke. When she died, I realized I'd wasted all those years being angry, instead of loving her. The tears came then, sudden and overwhelming, all the grief she'd been carrying for 6 years. Grief for Lily, for their lost relationship, for the sister she'd pushed away and could never apologize to. Harry watched her cry with the solemn attention of someone who understood that sometimes adults needed to be sad about important things. When her tears finally subsided, Harry reached across the table and patted her hand with the gentle comfort of someone far older than his, 6 years. "It's okay, Aunt Toonie," he said softly. "I think Mummy would be happy that you take care of me now. I think she would forgive you for being angry, because you saved me from Uncle Vernon, and you love me now." The generosity of his forgiveness, offered so simply and completely, made her cry again. But these were different tears, not just grief, but something that might eventually become healing. "I do love you," she said fiercely, "more than I ever imagined it was possible to love someone. And I think you're right. I think your mother would be proud of the boy you're becoming." They spent another hour in the bookshop, looking through more photographs and reading articles about Lily and James's time at Hogwarts, their work with the Order of the Phoenix, and their tragic deaths. Harry absorbed the information with the curiosity of someone learning about distant relatives, asking questions about what Hogwarts was like, and whether his parents had been good at magic, and whether they would have liked ice cream as much as he did. It was Professor McGonagall who suggested they visit Godric's Hollow. "It might give you both some peace," she said when Petunia recounted their afternoon discovery during their weekly tea. "Harry is old enough now to understand what happened, and you both might benefit from seeing where his parents lived and are buried." The idea terrified Petunia almost as much as it appealed to her. She'd never been to Godric's Hollow, had never seen the house where Lily and James had lived their brief happy marriage, or the cemetery where they now rested side by side. It felt like crossing a threshold she couldn't uncross, acknowledging a connection to Lily's life that she'd rejected while her sister was alive. But Harry was enthusiastic about the idea of seeing where his parents had lived, and Petunia found herself agreeing before she'd fully considered all the implications. Godric's Hollow was a picture-perfect village that seemed to exist in some idealized version of English countryside. Thatched cottages lined narrow streets, gardens bloomed with flowers that looked almost too perfect to be real, and everything carried the sort of timeless charm that made it feel like stepping into a storybook. The house where Lily and James had died stood at the end of a quiet street, partially ruined, but preserved as a memorial. A small plaque marked it as the site where Harry Potter had defeated the Dark Lord, and there were always fresh flowers left by visitors who came to pay their respects. Harry stood before it with solemn curiosity, trying to match the broken building to his vague, fragmentary memories of that terrible night. "I don't remember it," he said quietly. "I know something bad happened here, but I don't remember what it felt like." "That's probably for the best," Petunia said, taking his small hand in hers. "Some memories are too heavy for children to carry." The cemetery was at the end of a winding path that led through a grove of ancient oak trees. Lily and James's grave was marked by a simple white headstone that bore their names, dates, and the inscription, "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death." Fresh flowers covered the grave, roses, lilies, and other blooms left by people who had never met the Potters, but were grateful for their sacrifice. Harry read the headstone carefully, sounding out the words with the concentration he brought to all his reading. "What does that mean?" he asked, pointing to the inscription. "About the last enemy?" Petunia considered the question, trying to find words that a 6-year-old could understand. "I think it means that love is stronger than death. That even when people die, the love they had for us doesn't go away. Your parents loved you so much that their love protected you even after they were gone." Harry nodded solemnly, then did something that surprised her. He began talking to the headstone as if his parents could hear him. "Hello, Mummy and Daddy," he said in the conversational tone he might use with any adult. "I live with Aunt Toonie now, and we have a flat above an ice cream shop, and I can read chapter books all by myself. Aunt Toonie says you would be proud of me, and I think you would like her too. She was angry at Mummy before, but she's sorry now, and she takes very good care of me." The simple acceptance with which he spoke to his dead parents, as if death were just another form of distance rather than an insurmountable barrier, made Petunia's chest tight with emotion. At 6, Harry understood loss in a way that was both heartbreaking and strangely comforting. He knew his parents were gone, but he also seemed to feel their love as something present and ongoing. They sat by the grave for nearly an hour, with Harry chattering about his life in Diagon Alley, while Petunia found herself conducting a silent conversation with the sister she'd never properly mourned. "I'm sorry," she thought, staring at Lily's name carved in white stone. "I'm sorry I was so jealous and so proud and so afraid of your world that I couldn't see what a gift you were trying to share with me. I'm sorry I wasted our last years being angry when I could have been loving you. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me, and I'm sorry it took your death to teach me what really mattered. But I'm taking care of Harry," she added silently. "I'm trying to give him everything you would have wanted him to have. Love and safety and the freedom to be exactly who he's meant to be. I can't undo the mistakes I made with you, but I can make sure he never doubts how much he's wanted." When they finally left the cemetery, Harry was quiet but not sad. more thoughtful than anything else, as if he were processing new information that would take time to fully understand. They walked back through the village, hand in hand, stopping at a small cafe for tea and biscuits before returning to Diagon Alley. "Aunt Toonie," Harry said, as they settled back into their familiar evening routine. "I'm glad you were angry at Mummy." The statement was so unexpected that Petunia nearly dropped the book she'd been opening for their bedtime story. "What do you mean?" "If you hadn't been angry, you might not have married Uncle Vernon. And if you hadn't married Uncle Vernon, you wouldn't have been there to take care of me when Mummy and Daddy died. So, even though being angry made you sad, it was also good, because it meant you could save me." The logic was purely 6-year-old, linear and optimistic, and finding purpose in even painful experiences. But there was something profound in his interpretation of events, something that suggested a wisdom beyond his years. "I never thought of it that way," Petunia said honestly. "Sometimes bad things have to happen so good things can happen later," Harry said with the confidence of someone who had discovered an important truth. "Like how I had to live with Uncle Vernon, so I could understand how much better it is to live with you." That night, after Harry had fallen asleep, surrounded by his books and toys and all the evidence of a childhood filled with love rather than fear, Petunia sat by their window and looked out over Diagon Alley. Tomorrow, Professor McGonagall would bring the box of letters and photographs that Lily had sent to Hogwarts over the years, memories that would help Harry understand not just how his parents had died, but how they had lived. It wouldn't erase the years Petunia had lost with her sister, or undo the pain her rejection had caused. But perhaps it was enough to ensure that Harry would grow up knowing he came from love, and that the people who cared for him now had learned to choose love over fear. Perhaps, she thought, that was the most anyone could hope for, the chance to do better with the time they had left. Chapter 8. The Dark Mark in the Daily Prophet. The first report appeared on a grey November morning, buried on page 3 of the Daily Prophet, between an advertisement for Madame Malkin's winter collection and a cheerful piece about the upcoming Christmas decorations at Diagon Alley. Petunia might have missed it entirely if Mrs. Clearwater hadn't mentioned it during her morning ice cream run, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by worried lines around her eyes. "Did you see the article about the Muggle attacks?" she asked quietly, glancing around the shop to ensure Harry was out of earshot. He was in the back room, carefully arranging napkins and humming to himself with the contentment of a 6-year-old who felt completely secure in his world. "What attacks?" Petunia set down the scoop she'd been cleaning and turned her full attention to Mrs. Clearwater. In the year and a half since they'd made Diagon Alley their home, she'd learned to read the subtle cues that indicated when magical news was more serious than it first appeared. Mrs. Clearwater slid the Prophet across the counter, her finger pointing to a small headline: "Suspicious activity in Devon. Ministry investigating." The article was brief and deliberately vague, the kind of careful language newspapers used when they wanted to inform without causing panic. 3 Muggle families in Devon had been attacked in their homes over the past month. The perpetrators had left no trace except for a peculiar symbol burned into the front doors, a symbol that the ministry was investigating for possible magical connections. "The dark mark," Mrs. Clearwater said quietly when Petunia looked up from the article with confusion. It was the symbol Voldemort's followers used during the war. We haven't seen it for almost 6 years." The name sent a chill down Petunia's spine. Voldemort, the wizard who had killed Lily and James, the one Harry had somehow defeated as a baby. She'd heard the name spoken in whispers around Diagon Alley, always with the kind of reverent fear reserved for nightmares that might return if spoken too loudly. "But he's dead," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she realized how naive they sounded. Harry defeated him that night. Everyone says so. Voldemort is dead, yes, Mrs. Clearwater agreed carefully. But his followers, not all of them, were caught. Some escaped to other countries. Others claimed they were under magical compulsion. And there were always whispers that some of the worst ones were still out there, waiting. Waiting for what? Mrs. Clearwater's eyes flicked toward the back room, where Harry's humming could still be heard. For a chance at revenge, perhaps, or to finish what their master started. The words settled over Petunia like ice water. In the year since Harry had begun asking questions about his parents and his past, she'd allowed herself to believe that the worst dangers were behind them. Vernon had been neutralized by the courts. Harry was thriving in the magical world, and their daily life had settled into a rhythm of simple contentment that felt sustainable and safe. She'd forgotten that Harry Potter wasn't just a 6-year-old boy who helped with ice cream and read picture books. He was the boy who lived, the child who had destroyed the most feared dark wizard in generations. And there were people in the magical world who would see that as something to avenge rather than celebrate. The next few weeks brought a steady trickle of increasingly alarming news. More attacks, more dark marks, more families forced to flee their homes when the magical protections around them failed. The ministry issued statements about increased vigilance and ongoing investigations, but the carefully neutral language couldn't disguise the growing sense of unease that had settled over the magical community. Diagon Alley began to change in subtle ways. Shop owners closed earlier, parents kept their children closer, and conversations dropped to whispers when certain topics arose. The cheerful bustle that had characterized the magical street was replaced by a wariness that reminded Petunia uncomfortably of the tension she remembered from news reports during particularly bad periods of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. It was Auror Williams, the same official who had escorted Vernon from their shop over a year ago, who finally explained the situation fully. He arrived at their flat on a cold December evening, wearing the kind of expression that suggested official business of the most serious variety. "Mrs. Dursley," he said, after the pleasantries had been dispensed with, and Harry had been sent upstairs with a new book. "I'm afraid we need to discuss Harry's security arrangements." The words she'd been dreading. "The attacks," she said. "They're connected to Harry." "We believe so, yes. The families that have been targeted, they all had connections to the war effort against Voldemort. Order members, ministry employees who worked on the investigation, people who provided safe houses, or other support. The attacks appear to be systematic revenge against anyone who opposed the Death Eaters during the conflict. And Harry." Auror Williams's expression was grim. "Harry Potter is the ultimate symbol of Voldemort's defeat. If these remaining Death Eaters are indeed seeking revenge, he would be their highest priority target." Petunia felt the familiar clench of fear in her stomach, the same sensation she'd experienced when Vernon's letters had started arriving. But magnified tenfold, Vernon had been one angry man, with limited resources and legal constraints. Death Eaters were trained killers with magical abilities, and no regard for innocent life. "What do you recommend?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "Increased protection to start. We'd like to assign an Auror detail to monitor the shop and your flat. We'd also recommend relocating to a more secure location, somewhere with stronger protective enchantments and better natural defenses." "You want us to leave Diagon Alley?" The thought was almost unbearable. This place had become home in a way that Privet Drive never had. Harry had friends here, routines, a sense of belonging that had taken months to develop. Temporarily, perhaps, until we can neutralize the remaining threats. That night, Petunia lay awake, listening to Harry's breathing from the bed across the room and trying to process the impossible choice she was facing. Stay in the place where Harry was happy and secure, but potentially vulnerable to magical terrorists, or uproot their lives again, for the sake of safety that might not even be guaranteed, in a new location. The nightmares started 3 days later. Petunia woke to the sound of Harry screaming and the unmistakable crack of breaking glass. She found him sitting up in bed, his small body shaking with terror, while every window in their flat bore spiderweb fractures that spread across the glass like frost. "They were here," he gasped, reaching for her with desperate hands. "The hooded people. They were in our room, and they were angry and they wanted to hurt us because of something I did, but I don't remember what I did wrong." "Shh, sweetheart," she murmured, pulling him close and feeling his heart racing against her chest. "It was just a dream. You're safe. No one can hurt us here." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. The protective enchantments around Diagon Alley were strong, but they weren't absolute. And Harry's nightmares were manifesting with the kind of violent magical energy that suggested his subconscious was picking up on threats that his conscious mind couldn't yet process. The breaking point came when Vernon requested an emergency custody review. The letter arrived via official ministry owl, accompanied by documentation from Vernon's solicitor, arguing that the recent Death Eater activity proved Harry was too dangerous to remain with a Muggle guardian who couldn't adequately protect him. Vernon was requesting temporary custody transfer for the safety of all parties involved, including specific mention of his concern for Dudley's welfare during his supervised visits. "He's trying to use the Death Eater threat against us," Andromeda Tonks explained during an emergency consultation, arguing that the magical world's inability to protect Harry proves he'd be safer in Muggle custody where Death Eaters wouldn't think to look for him. Would that work? Petunia asked, though the thought of surrendering Harry to Vernon made her feel physically ill. Not legally, no. The Wisengamot would never award custody to someone who has documented history of abusing the child in question. But Vernon's request will trigger a review process, which means you'll need to testify about your ability to ensure Harry's safety in the current circumstances. The hearing was scheduled for the week before Christmas, in the same hybrid courtroom where they'd fought for custody nearly a year ago. This time, however, the atmosphere was distinctly different. The magical officials, who had seemed so confident and authoritative before now, carried themselves with the wariness of people operating under threat conditions. Petunia took the stand, wearing her best dress, and the kind of determined calm she'd learned to project when facing situations that terrified her. Vernon sat in the gallery with his solicitor, his expression smug with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd finally found the leverage he needed to reclaim control. Mrs. Dursley began the lead Wisengamot member, a stern-faced witch whose voice carried the weight of someone unaccustomed to having her authority questioned. "Are you aware of the current security threats facing Harry Potter?" "Yes, my lady. I've been briefed by ministry officials about the Death Eater activity and the potential danger to Harry. And do you believe you are qualified to ensure his safety in these circumstances?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Petunia looked across the courtroom at Harry, who was sitting with Professor McGonagall and watching the proceedings with the quiet attention of a child who understood that important decisions were being made about his future. "I believe," she said carefully, "that Harry's safety depends on more than magical protections or security arrangements. It depends on being surrounded by people who love him, who understand his needs, and who are committed to his welfare above all other considerations." "That's a very touching sentiment," Vernon's solicitor interjected, "but it doesn't address the practical realities. Mrs. Dursley is a Muggle with no magical training and no ability to defend against magical attacks. How can she possibly protect this child against trained killers with supernatural abilities? The same way any parent protects their child, Petunia replied, her voice growing stronger. By making the hard choices necessary to keep them safe. By accepting help when it's needed. By putting their welfare above my own comfort or preferences. She turned to address the Wizengamot directly. If remaining in Diagon Alley puts Harry at risk, then we'll relocate. If additional protective measures are necessary, then I'll consent to them. If ministry officials believe Harry needs a security detail, then I'll cooperate fully with whatever arrangements they recommend, even if those measures significantly disrupt Harry's daily life, pressed the Wizengamot member. Petunia glanced again at Harry, thinking of his contentment in their small flat, his friendships with the other magical children, his joy in the simple routine of helping at the ice cream shop. All of it would be lost if they were forced to relocate for security reasons. Harry's happiness matters, she said quietly, but his safety matters more. If the choice is between preserving his current life and preserving his life itself, then there's no choice at all. The deliberation was brief. The Wizengamot ruled that custody would remain with Petunia, but with enhanced security conditions that included immediate relocation to a ministry safe house and ongoing evaluation of the threat level. Vernon's petition was dismissed, with what appeared to be barely concealed contempt for his attempt to exploit a serious security situation. The safe house turned out to be a cottage in rural Wales, surrounded by protective enchantments so strong that the air itself seemed to shimmer with magical energy. It was comfortable and well-appointed, with gardens for Harry to explore and books to keep him occupied, but it felt like a prison after the vibrant community life of Diagon Alley. "I miss Florian," Harry said on their third evening in Wales, staring out the cottage window at the empty countryside beyond. "And Mrs. Clearwater, and the moving pictures in the shop windows, and the way the street lamps sang sometimes at night." "I know, sweetheart," Petunia said, settling beside him on the window seat and pulling him close. "I miss those things too. I don't know, until it's safe for us to go home, at least." Harry was quiet for several minutes, processing this information with the seriousness he brought to all discussions of their uncertain future. Finally, he looked up at her with the direct gaze that always reminded her so powerfully of Lily. "Aunt Toonie," he said, "are the bad people looking for me because I defeated the Dark Lord when I was a baby?" The question she'd been dreading. At 6 years old, Harry was beginning to understand the broader implications of his fame, the reasons why strangers looked at him with reverence or fear, the weight of expectations that came with being the boy who lived. "Yes," she said honestly. "Some people are still angry about what happened that night, and they blame you for their master's defeat. But I don't remember doing anything brave," Harry said quietly. "I was just a baby. I don't understand why everyone thinks I'm special." Petunia chose her words carefully. Sometimes special things happen to ordinary people, and they become important without meaning to. What matters isn't whether you remember being brave. It's what you choose to do now, knowing that people need you to be safe so you can grow up and decide what kind of person you want to become. Harry nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with this explanation. Outside their protective cottage, Welsh countryside stretched away toward distant mountains, peaceful and isolated, and nothing like the warm community they'd left behind in Diagon Alley. But they were safe, and they were together, and for now, Petunia told herself, that would have to be enough. Chapter 9. The letter from a black dog March arrived in the Welsh countryside with an unexpected warmth that seemed to promise spring might finally overcome the long winter they'd endured in isolation. From the kitchen window of their ministry safe house, Petunia could see the first green shoots pushing through the dark earth of the garden, and Harry had spent the morning collecting interesting stones from the stream that ran behind the cottage. At 6.5 years old, he was adapting to their isolated life with the resilience that never ceased to amaze her. But she could see the longing in his eyes when he talked about their friends in Diagon Alley or asked when they might be able to go home. The news of Sirius Black's escape reached them via an emergency ministry owl that arrived during their morning tea. Its normally pristine feathers ruffled with the urgency of bad news delivered at speed. Petunia recognized the official seal immediately. She'd learned to distinguish between routine correspondence and crisis communications during their months under ministry protection. "What is it, Aunt Toonie?" Harry asked, looking up from the picture book he'd been reading aloud to his collection of interesting stones. He'd arranged them in careful rows on the parlor rug, and was apparently telling them a story about brave knights and helpful dragons. "Just ministry business, sweetheart," she said, though her hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal. "Keep reading to your stones. I think they're enjoying the story." The letter was brief and devastating. "Mrs. Dursley, we regret to inform you that the prisoner Sirius Black has escaped from Azkaban prison. Black is considered extremely dangerous and is believed to be seeking Harry Potter specifically. Enhanced security measures are being implemented immediately. Under no circumstances should you attempt to leave the safe house or allow anyone access to the property. Additional Auror protection will be in place within the hour. Auror Williams, Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes." The name Sirius Black was familiar, though it took Petunia several moments to place it. She'd heard it mentioned during the custody hearings, always in the context of the Potter betrayal. The friend who had revealed Lily and James's location to Voldemort, who had sold out the people who trusted him most. Harry's godfather, according to the official records, though that relationship had been severed when his treachery was discovered. Aunt Toonie? Harry had abandoned his stones and was watching her with the concerned expression that meant he'd recognized her distress despite her attempts to hide it. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing that concerns you, sweetheart." She lied, then immediately felt guilty for the deception. They'd built their relationship on honesty, and Harry was old enough to sense when adults were keeping important information from him. "There's just some news from the ministry. That means we need to be extra careful for a while." Harry nodded solemnly, apparently willing to accept this explanation for now, but she could see the questions forming behind his green eyes. At 6.5, he was becoming increasingly sophisticated about the adult world and its complications, and she knew it wouldn't be long before he demanded a fuller explanation. The additional auras arrived within the hour. Two stern-faced individuals who introduced themselves as specialists in high-security protection details. They immediately began strengthening the cottage's defensive enchantments, their wands tracing complex patterns in the air that left shimmering trails of light around the doors and windows. "Is this about the Death Eater attacks?" Petunia asked during their security briefing, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Related, but more specific," replied the senior Auror, a middle-aged witch whose voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with crisis situations. "Sirius Black was Harry Potter's designated godfather before his betrayal of the Potter family. He has specific knowledge about Harry's whereabouts and protection arrangements that makes him uniquely dangerous." The betrayal. Petunia had heard references to it during the legal proceedings, always delivered in the carefully neutral language officials used when discussing uncomfortable truths. Harry's godfather, the person who should have been his protector, had instead been the one to deliver him to his enemies. Why would he want to hurt Harry now? She asked. Voldemort is dead. What could he possibly gain? The Aurors exchanged a look that suggested there were complications they weren't authorized to discuss. Black was one of Voldemort's most devoted followers, the senior Auror said carefully. The fact that his master is gone doesn't necessarily mean his loyalty has wavered. Some Death Eaters see Harry Potter as unfinished business, the one who caused their downfall. That evening, after Harry had been settled in bed, with his stones arranged on the nightstand where he could see them, Petunia sat by the cottage's front window and watched the darkening countryside for signs of movement. The enhanced security made her feel safer in theory, but the knowledge that someone with intimate access to Harry's history was actively hunting them brought back all the fears she'd thought were behind them. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by the most enormous black dog she'd ever seen. Petunia was hanging washing in the back garden when the creature appeared at the edge of the protective barrier, so large and wild-looking that her first instinct was to call for the Aurors. But something about the dog's behavior stopped her. It wasn't aggressive or threatening, but rather seemed to be waiting for her to notice it. When their eyes met across the garden, the dog lifted one massive paw and carefully placed a folded piece of parchment on the ground before backing away several steps. The message was written in handwriting that managed to convey both desperation and careful control. Mrs. Dursley, I know you have no reason to trust me, and every reason to fear me. I know what you've been told about my role in James and Lily's deaths, and I know how it must look from your perspective. But I need you to know the truth, for Harry's sake, if not for mine. I did not betray James and Lily Potter. I would have died before revealing their location to Voldemort or anyone else. The real traitor was Peter Pettigrew, a secret we kept even from Dumbledore in those final days. I have spent 6 years in Azkaban for a crime I did not commit, while the true betrayer has lived free and hidden. I escaped, not for revenge, but because I realized that as long as Pettigrew remains undetected, Harry will never be truly safe. I am Harry's godfather. I loved Lily like the sister I never had, and I have thought of Harry every day since the night I lost them all. I'm not asking you to trust me completely. I'm asking you to let me prove my innocence, and to let me finally meet the boy I've failed to protect for so long. I will be waiting by the old oak tree beyond the stream tomorrow at sunset. Come alone if you're willing to hear the truth. Don't come at all if you're not prepared to question what you've been told. Sirius Black. Petunia read the letter 3 times, her mind racing through implications and possibilities that felt too dangerous to fully consider. Everything she'd been told about Sirius Black painted him as a traitor and a killer, someone who had sold out his best friends for power or ideology. But the handwriting was that of someone educated and desperate, not the scrawl of a madman, and the tone spoke of grief and loss rather than malice. More troubling was the name Peter Pettigrew. She'd heard it mentioned during the official briefings as one of the other victims of that terrible night, a friend who had tried to confront Black about his betrayal and been killed for his heroism. If Black was claiming Pettigrew was actually the traitor, Aunt Toonie. Harry appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair tousled from his afternoon nap, and his expression concerned. Why do you look worried? She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. Just thinking about grown-up things, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. But Harry was 6½ now, old enough to recognize evasion when he heard it. Is it about the bad man who escaped from prison? The Aurors were talking about him when they thought I couldn't hear. The directness of the question caught her off guard. She'd underestimated how much Harry was picking up from the adult conversations around him, how much he understood about the threats that surrounded his life. Yes, she said honestly, it's about him. Is he coming to hurt us? I don't know, she admitted. He says he isn't. But But you don't know if you should believe him, Harry finished, with the matter-of-fact understanding that came from his experience with adults who said one thing while meaning another. That night, Petunia lay awake, staring at the ceiling and weighing impossible choices. Every instinct told her to alert the Auras immediately, to turn over the letter and let ministry officials handle the situation. But something about Black's words, the grief in them, the specificity of his claims about Peter Pettigrew, made her hesitate. What if he was telling the truth? What if the man everyone believed was Harry's betrayer was actually the one person who might be able to protect him from the real danger? The next morning, she sent word to Professor McGonagall via emergency owl, requesting an urgent consultation about a development in Harry's security situation. McGonagall arrived within 2 hours, her expression grave, and her manner suggesting she already suspected what this was about. "He contacted you," she said without preamble, after they'd settled in the cottage's small sitting room. "Harry was outside with one of the Auras, practicing his letters by writing messages in the dirt with a stick. You knew he would try." "I suspected he might. Sirius Black is, someone who feels deeply and acts on those feelings, regardless of consequences. If he has indeed escaped to seek out Harry, he wouldn't be deterred by ministry protection or official warnings." Petunia pulled out the letter and handed it to Professor McGonagall. "What do you think? Is any of this possible?" McGonagall read in silence, her expression growing more troubled with each line. When she finished, she set the letter carefully on the table between them and removed her glasses to clean them. A gesture that Petunia had learned indicated deep thought. "The claims about Peter Pettigrew are troubling," she said finally. "There were always questions about how Voldemort discovered the Potter's location. The Secret Keeper spell is extremely powerful. It should have been impossible to extract that information through torture or magical compulsion. But if Sirius Black was the Secret Keeper, that's what we were told. Yes, but if Black is telling the truth about Pettigrew..." McGonagall trailed off, apparently unwilling to voice the implications. "You think there might be something to his claims?" "I think," Professor McGonagall said carefully, "that the official version of events was assembled very quickly in the aftermath of a traumatic night. Mistakes may have been made in the rush to assign blame and close the investigation." "So, what do I do?" Professor McGonagall replaced her glasses and fixed Petunia with the sharp gaze that had intimidated countless students over the years. "You do what you think is best for Harry, but you do it carefully, with proper precautions. And you remember that whatever Sirius Black's intentions, he is a man who has spent 6 years in Azkaban. That experience changes people in ways that aren't always immediately apparent." The meeting took place at sunset, by the old oak tree that stood beyond the stream, marking the boundary of the cottage's immediate grounds. Petunia brought Harry with her, despite every instinct screaming that it was dangerous. But if Black was telling the truth about being Harry's godfather, then Harry deserved to meet him. And if he was lying, well, the Auras were close enough to intervene, if needed. The man who stepped out from behind the oak tree bore little resemblance to the handsome, laughing figure she'd glimpsed in old photographs. Sirius Black was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his dark hair hanging lank and unkempt around a face that spoke of years of suffering. But when his eyes fell on Harry, his expression transformed completely. Grief and wonder and desperate love, all warring for dominance. "Hello, Harry," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm serious. I was your father's best friend, and I've been wanting to meet you for a very long time." Harry studied him with the careful attention he brought to all new adults, apparently sensing the weight of this moment, even if he didn't fully understand its significance. "Are you the bad man who escaped from prison?" "Yes," Sirius said honestly, earning points in Petunia's estimation for not trying to soften the truth. "I escaped from prison. But I'm not a bad man, Harry. I'm someone who made mistakes and was blamed for things he didn't do. Like when Uncle Vernon said I broke things that broke by themselves. Something like that." "Yes." Harry nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with this explanation. "Aunt Toonie says sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about who did what, especially when they're scared or angry." "Your Aunt Toonie is very wise," Sirius said, glancing at Petunia with an expression that might have been gratitude. "And she's taken very good care of you. Your parents would be proud of the boy you've become." For the next hour, Sirius talked to Harry about James and Lily, not the sanitized version from official histories or newspaper accounts, but the real people they'd been, James's terrible jokes and his talent for getting into trouble, Lily's fierce loyalty and her gift for making anyone feel welcome, the way they'd looked at each other like they'd discovered something miraculous, and the way they'd talked about their son even before he was born. "Your father and I got into so much trouble at school," Sirius said, his voice warming with memory. "We had this map. We called it the Marauder's Map, that showed every secret passage and hidden room in Hogwarts. We knew more ways to sneak out of the castle than the professors knew existed." "Were you friends with Mummy too?" Harry asked. "Your mother was the reason your father became worth being friends with," Sirius said with a smile that transformed his haggard face. "She wouldn't give him the time of day until he stopped showing off and learned to be kind to people who couldn't fight back. Once he figured that out, they were inseparable." It was only when the sun had fully set and the cottage windows were glowing with warm light that Sirius finally addressed the question that hung over everything. "Harry," he said gently, "do you know what a godfather is?" Harry shook his head. "It's someone your parents chose to take care of you if anything ever happened to them. Someone they trusted to love you and protect you and make sure you grew up knowing how much they wanted you. Like Aunt Toonie does, your parents chose me to be your godfather, Harry. I was supposed to take care of you after they died, but I couldn't, because people thought I had done something terrible that I didn't actually do." Harry considered this information with the seriousness he brought to all discussions of his complicated family situation. "So you're supposed to be my family too?" "I'd like to be, if you'll have me," Sirius said quietly. "I know I can't make up for all the time I've lost, and I know your Aunt Toonie is doing a wonderful job taking care of you. But I loved your parents, and I love you. And I'd like to be part of your life if that's possible." The simple acceptance with which Harry nodded, as if the addition of a long-lost godfather was just another interesting development in a life that had already included many surprises, made both adults smile despite the gravity of the situation. "But first," Sirius said, his expression growing serious again, "we need to find Peter Pettigrew and make sure everyone knows the truth about what really happened that night. Because, until we do, you'll never be completely safe." As they walked back to the cottage together, Harry skipping between Petunia and his newly discovered godfather, Petunia, found herself wondering if the truth they were seeking would be worth the dangers it might bring. But, looking at Harry's bright, curious face and Sirius's desperate hope for redemption, she realized that some truths were worth any risk. The only question now was how to prove what had really happened on that terrible night 6 years ago. Chapter 10. The Rat in the Garden. Summer had fully settled over the Welsh countryside by the time the rat appeared, bringing with it the kind of warm, lazy afternoons that made their isolation feel less like protective custody and more like an extended holiday. Harry, who had turned 7 in July, with a birthday celebration that included both Petunia and Sirius for the first time, was spending increasing amounts of time in the cottage's back garden, where he'd discovered a fascinating ecosystem of creatures that seemed drawn to his presence. It had become a daily routine. After breakfast and morning lessons with the correspondence materials Professor McGonagall had arranged, Harry would venture outside with a book and settle beneath the old apple tree that dominated one corner of the garden. Within minutes, he would invariably be surrounded by birds, rabbits, field mice, and other small creatures that appeared to find his company as interesting as he found theirs. "It's his magic," Sirius explained during one of his carefully supervised visits, watching through the kitchen window as Harry sat perfectly still while a red squirrel investigated his outstretched hand. "Some magical children have an affinity for living things. Animals can sense the gentleness in him, the lack of threat." Petunia nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she understood. Harry's relationship with the local wildlife was just one more aspect of his magical development that left her feeling grateful for Sirius's presence and expertise. Over the past few months, her initial wariness of Harry's godfather had given way to genuine appreciation for the knowledge and perspective he brought to Harry's upbringing. "Will it continue as he gets older?" she asked. "Probably, though it may become more focused. Some adults can speak with specific animals. Others can heal injured creatures. Still others become skilled with magical beasts that most people fear. It depends on where his interests develop." The rat appeared on a Tuesday morning in late August, distinguishing itself immediately from the usual garden visitors by its unusual behavior, while the rabbits and birds that came to see Harry were naturally curious, but ultimately wild creatures. The rat seemed almost thoughtful. It sat at the edge of the garden watching Harry with an intelligence that struck Petunia as distinctly unnatural, even for a magical household. "Harry's sweetheart," she called from the kitchen doorway. "Perhaps you should come inside for a while." "It's all right, Aunt Toonie," Harry replied without looking away from the rat. "He's just watching. I don't think he wants to hurt anything." But there was something in the rat's behavior that made Petunia increasingly uncomfortable. Most of Harry's animal visitors eventually approached him, drawn by the gentle magic that seemed to radiate from his small frame. This rat, however, maintained its distance while clearly focusing on Harry with an intensity that felt more human than animal. When Sirius arrived for his afternoon visit, a routine that had been established after weeks of careful negotiation with ministry officials, Petunia mentioned the rat, almost in passing. "There's an odd creature been watching Harry from the garden," she said as they settled in the kitchen for tea. "A rat that's been coming by for nearly a week now. It's probably nothing, but something about it bothers me." Sirius paused in the act of stirring his tea, his expression suddenly sharp with attention. "A rat, grey and brown. It just sits there watching Harry. Never comes close, but never leaves either." "Show me," Sirius said quietly, and something in his tone made Petunia set down her cup without argument. Day moved to the window that overlooked the back garden, where Harry was reading aloud to his usual collection of small creatures. The rat sat apart from the others, positioned near the garden shed, where it had an unobstructed view of Harry's activities. Sirius went completely still, his face draining of color as he stared at the creature. "No," he breathed. "It can't be." "What can't be?" "That rat." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know that rat." Before Petunia could ask what he meant, Sirius was striding toward the back door with grim purpose. She followed, her heart beginning to race with a fear she couldn't yet name. "Harry," Sirius called as he emerged into the garden, his voice carrying a note of command that made the boy look up immediately. "Come here, please. Right now." Harry must have sensed the urgency in his godfather's tone, because he rose without argument and moved quickly toward the adults. The moment Harry began to move, The rat also shifted, back in toward the garden's edge, as if preparing to flee. "Oh, no, you don't," Sirius muttered, drawing his wand with a fluid motion. "Peter Pettigrew, you coward, face me." The rat froze at the sound of the name, its small body going rigid with what looked like terror. For a moment, nothing happened except the soft rustling of leaves in the afternoon breeze. Then, incredibly, the rat began to change. It was unlike anything Petunia had ever witnessed. The creature's form seemed to blur and expand, fur melting away to reveal pale flesh, tiny limbs stretching and thickening until what had been a rat was suddenly a man. A thin, balding man with watery eyes and a face marked by years of guilt and fear. Harry made a small sound of surprise, pressing closer to Petunia's side while staring at the transformation with wide eyes. "How did he do that? Is that magic?" "Yes," Sirius said grimly, never taking his eyes off the cowering figure. "That's magic, Harry. And that's Peter Pettigrew, the man who betrayed your parents." Pettigrew was trying to back away, his hands raised in a gesture that was equal parts surrender and plea. "Sirius," he said, his voice high and reedy with panic. "Sirius, please, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Sirius snarled, his wand trained steadily on his former friend. "I understand that you sold out James and Lily to Voldemort. I understand that you let me rot in Azkaban for 6 years while you lived as a rat, free and safe while I was blamed for your treachery." "I had no choice," Pettigrew whined. "The Dark Lord. He would have killed me. He would have tortured me until I told him anyway. So you decided to save yourself and let your friends die instead." Petunia found her voice at last. "This is him? This is the man who—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the enormity of what she was seeing. "This is Peter Pettigrew," Sirius confirmed, his voice hard as stone. "James and Lily's secret keeper, the one who gave Voldemort their location and then faked his own death when I tried to confront him." "Aunt Toonie," Harry said quietly, tugging on her sleeve. "Is that the bad man? The one who hurt my parents?" The simple question seemed to break something in Pettigrew's composure. He fell to his knees in the cottage garden, his thin frame shaking with what might have been sobs. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "I'm so sorry, Harry. I never meant for it to happen like that. I thought if I just gave him the information, he would leave me alone. I didn't think he would actually kill them." "You knew exactly what Voldemort was," Sirius said with deadly quiet. "You knew what he did to people who opposed him. You knew what he would do to James and Lily, and you told him anyway." "I was afraid," Pettigrew cried. "You don't know what it was like." "You were always so brave, so confident. James too. But I was never like that. When the Dark Lord's followers came for me, when they said join or die, I couldn't. I wasn't strong enough to die. So you let better people die instead," Petunia said, her voice cold with disgust. This pathetic creature had destroyed her sister's life, had stolen Harry's parents, had let an innocent man suffer in prison for years. Looking at him now, she couldn't imagine how anyone had ever trusted him with something so precious as Lily and James's lives. "Please," Pettigrew begged, looking between Sirius and Petunia with desperate eyes. "Please, I can make it right. I can testify. I can tell them what really happened. Sirius, you'll be free. Completely free. Your name will be cleared." Sirius replied, "And you think confession now makes up for 6 years in Azkaban? 6 years away from Harry, while he grew up thinking his godfather was the one who killed his parents?" Pettigrew's gaze fell on Harry, who was watching the proceedings with the fascinated attention of a child, witnessing something important that he didn't fully understand. "Harry," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Are you really the one who hurt my mummy and daddy?" Harry asked with the directness that always characterized his approach to difficult topics. Pettigrew nodded miserably. "Yes, I told a very bad man where to find them, and he hurt them because of what I did." "Why?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Why indeed? What possible reason could justify betraying friends, destroying families, allowing innocent people to suffer for crimes they didn't commit? "Because I was scared," Pettigrew whispered. "And because I was selfish. And because I thought my life was worth more than anyone else's." Harry considered this explanation with the seriousness he brought to all adult confessions of wrongdoing. Finally, he nodded as if filing the information away for future consideration. "I think," he said solemnly, "that you were wrong." The simple statement, delivered with a 7-year-old's moral clarity, seemed to hit Pettigrew harder than any of Sirius's angry accusations. He doubled over as if struck, his thin shoulders shaking with genuine grief. It was then that the ministry auras arrived, summoned by the magical alarms that had triggered when Pettigrew transformed from his animagus form. They emerged from the cottage with wands drawn, clearly prepared for a confrontation with the escaped prisoner, Sirius Black. What they found, instead, was a scene that would require extensive documentation and careful testimony. Peter Pettigrew, supposedly dead for 6 years, kneeling in confession before the man who had been wrongly imprisoned for his crimes. The next few hours were a blur of official procedures, truth serums, and formal statements that would ultimately clear Sirius's name and establish Pettigrew's guilt beyond any possible doubt. Harry, fascinated by the magical law enforcement process, countless questions about how truth serums worked and whether all criminals eventually confessed when confronted with evidence. It was only when the officials had departed with their prisoner and the cottage had returned to its usual quiet that the full implications of the day's events began to settle over the small family. "What happens now?" Petunia asked as they sat together in the garden where the drama had unfolded. Harry was leaning against Sirius's side, apparently taking comfort in the physical presence of his newly vindicated godfather. "Now," Sirius said quietly, "I can officially be Harry's guardian, if that's what you want," he added, looking at her with an expression that managed to be both hopeful and carefully respectful. "It's what Harry's parents wanted," she said simply. "And it's what Harry needs. Someone who can guide his magical development and share real memories of Lily and James." "But what about you?" Harry asked, sitting up with sudden concern. "Aunt Toonie, you'll still be my family too, right? Even if Sirius is my guardian now." The worry in his voice made her chest tight with affection. After 2 years of careful healing and growing trust, Harry still sometimes feared that changes in circumstances might mean losing the people he'd grown to love. "Always," she assured him. "Families don't stop being families just because paperwork changes. Sirius will be your guardian, but I'll always be your aunt who loves you very much." "Good," Harry said with satisfaction, settling back against Sirius's side. "I like having lots of family. It feels safer than just having one person." Looking at them together, her nephew and his godfather, both dark-haired and green-eyed, and carrying the genetic legacy of the Evans and Potter families, Petunia felt something like peace settle in her chest. This was what Lily would have wanted for her son: safety, love, and the freedom to grow into whoever he was meant to become. The custody transfer would be formalized within the week, but for tonight, they were simply a family that had finally found its way to the truth. Chapter 11. The House on Grimmauld Place. The renovations to 12 Grimmauld Place began in early September. when the late summer heat was finally giving way to the crisp promise of autumn, and Harry was asking daily questions about when he would start proper school, like other 7-year-olds. From her position at the kitchen table of the newly cleared house, Petunia watched Sirius direct a team of magical contractors with the nervous energy of someone who had never been responsible for child-proofing anything, let alone an entire London townhouse that had been neglected for nearly a decade. The stairs need banisters that won't bite, Sirius was saying to a particularly burly wizard who seemed to specialize in defensive household modifications. And all the portraits need to be either removed or silenced permanently. This is going to be a home for a 7-year-old, not a museum of pure-blood supremacy. Harry, meanwhile, was exploring the upper floors with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had learned to assess new living spaces for potential dangers and hidden comforts. He'd been delighted to discover that his new bedroom would have a proper window overlooking a small garden, and had spent considerable time planning where to put his books and whether the room was large enough to accommodate both his bed and a space for arranging his rock collection. "It's bigger than our whole flat," he'd reported to Petunia with satisfaction. "And Sirius says I can paint the walls any color I want, and there's a library with books that move their pictures around when you're not looking." The transition from ministry safe house to proper family home was happening gradually, with Harry spending several days each week at Grimmauld Place, while Sirius learned the practical aspects of caring for a magical child. Petunia found herself in the unexpected role of consultant on everything from nutritious meal planning to age-appropriate bedtimes, helping Sirius navigate the complexities of raising someone whose needs went far beyond simply providing food and shelter. "He needs routine," she explained during one of their planning sessions. Watching Harry practice his letters at the newly installed kitchen table, while Sirius took notes with the dedication of someone studying for important exams. Not rigid schedules, but predictable patterns that help him feel secure. Breakfast at roughly the same time, quiet time for reading, physical activity outdoors when possible. What about magical education? He's showing more accidental magic lately, and I want to make sure he learns proper control before he starts Muggle school. It was a conversation they'd had several times over the past few weeks, as they worked out the delicate balance between preparing Harry for life in both worlds. Too much focus on magic might make it difficult for him to relate to non-magical peers. Too little might leave him unprepared for the magical education that would dominate his teenage years. Professor McGonagall recommended some basic exercises, Petunia said, consulting the notes she'd been keeping about Harry's development. Simple meditation techniques to help him recognize when his magic is responding to emotions, and games that teach him to direct energy intentionally rather than accidentally. And you're comfortable with that, with him learning to use magic deliberately. And Petunia appreciated Sirius's recognition that this represented a fundamental shift in how she thought about Harry's abilities. 2 years ago, she'd been married to a man who believed magic should be suppressed entirely. Now she was helping plan a magical education for her nephew. "I'm comfortable with Harry learning to be exactly who he's meant to be," she said, "which includes being a wizard who happens to have been raised with an appreciation for the non-magical world as well." Integration was happening more smoothly than any of them had expected. Harry adapted to Grimmauld Place with the resilience he brought to all changes, delighting in the house elves who prepared meals that sometimes cooked themselves, and books that read themselves aloud when he was too tired to focus on the words. But he also insisted on maintaining connections to the Muggle world, asking to visit the local library, wanting to learn to ride a bicycle like other children his age, and requesting that his room include space for both magical and non-magical toys. "I want to be good at both kinds of things," he explained when Sirius asked about his interest in Muggle activities. Like Aunt Toonie is good at magic shop work, but also good at regular cooking and knowing about regular schools and things that don't move by themselves. It was Vernon's final attempt at interference that ultimately crystallized how complete the transformation had become. The letter arrived via Muggle post on a grey October morning, addressed to Petunia at Grimmauld Place and written on the official letterhead of Vernon's new solicitor. The contents were predictably demanding. A request for reasonable access to Harry, backed by threats to pursue grandparents' rights, through Dudley's connection and warnings about the unsuitable environment Harry was being raised in. He's claiming that raising Harry in a magical household constitutes child endangerment, Petunia said, reading the letter aloud to Sirius, while Harry played in the garden under the watchful eye of one of the house elves. And he wants supervised visitation reinstated, on the grounds that Pettigrew's confession proves Harry needs protection from dangerous magical criminals. Sirius's expression darkened. As she read, "He's trying to use my criminal record against us, even though I've been completely exonerated. More than that, he's trying to exploit the Pettigrew situation to argue that the magical world is inherently dangerous for Harry. Listen to this. The recent revelation that Mr. Potter was betrayed by trusted magical associates demonstrates the ongoing security risks associated with his current living arrangements. What does he want, exactly?" Petunia scanned to the end of the letter, her disgust growing with each paragraph. Joint custody, alternating weeks between households, and a requirement that Harry's magical education be delayed until he's old enough to make informed choices about his involvement with supernatural communities. The letter was so thoroughly divorced from reality that it might have been laughable if it weren't also a reminder of how Vernon viewed Harry, not as a person with his own needs and preferences, but as an object to be controlled and shaped according to Vernon's vision of appropriate childhood development. "Should we be concerned?" Sirius asked. "Legally, I mean. Could he actually challenge the custody arrangement?" Petunia considered the question seriously. Vernon's threats had once been genuinely frightening, backed by his legal authority as Harry's uncle, and her own lack of resources or support. Now, however, the situation was entirely different. Sirius was Harry's legal guardian. With full ministry backing, Harry was clearly thriving in his current environment, and Vernon's history of abuse was thoroughly documented. "No," she said finally. "He can't challenge anything. But I think it's time to make sure he understands that permanently." The response was delivered not by letter, but by personal visit, with Petunia arriving at 4 Privet Drive, accompanied by Andromeda Tonks and an official ministry representative. Vernon's expression when he opened the door, to find his estranged wife flanked by magical legal authorities, was worth documenting for posterity. "Hello, Vernon," Petunia said pleasantly. "I believe you sent me a letter." The conversation that followed was brief and decisive. Vernon's threats were systematically dismantled by Mrs. Tonks, who pointed out that his parental rights had been terminated following documented abuse, that his custody challenges had been repeatedly rejected by competent courts, and that any further harassment of Harry's guardians would result in formal legal action. Moreover, Mrs. Tonks added, with professional satisfaction, "The ministry takes a very dim view of Muggles who threaten magical children or attempt to interfere with their proper development. Continued interference could result in memory modification to ensure you forget Harry's existence entirely." Vernon's face went through several interesting color changes as the implications sank in. "You can't be serious." "Perfectly serious," the ministry representative confirmed. "The welfare of magical children supersedes all other considerations, Mr. Dursley. If you continue to pose a threat to Harry Potter's emotional or physical well-being, we will take whatever steps are necessary to protect him. Furthermore," Petunia added, her voice carrying a calm authority that would have been unimaginable 2 years ago. I'm formally requesting dissolution of our marriage and complete termination of any legal connections between you and Harry. I'll be reverting to my maiden name and want no further contact with you or your family. The divorce proceedings were finalized within 6 weeks, with Petunia Evans emerging from the legal process feeling lighter than she had in years. Reclaiming her original name felt like shedding a costume that had never quite fit properly. Returning to the person she'd been before, fear and insecurity had led her into a marriage that had slowly poisoned everything it touched. How does it feel? Sirius asked during the celebration dinner they held to mark the official end of her marriage. Harry had insisted on helping prepare the meal and was proudly describing how he'd learned to make the vegetables cut themselves while still maintaining proper proportions. Free, she said simply, like I can finally make choices based on what's right instead of what's safe. The final piece of their reconstituted family arrived in November, when Remus Lupin returned from what he described as extended research abroad, and appeared on their doorstep carrying a battered suitcase and an apologetic expression. I would have come sooner, he said after the initial round of introductions and explanations. But I needed to make sure my condition was properly managed before I could be around Harry safely. His condition, it transpired, was lycanthropy, a magical affliction that transformed him into a werewolf once monthly, but was otherwise manageable with proper precautions and recently developed potions. Harry, who had never encountered a werewolf but had read several books about magical creatures, was fascinated, rather than frightened, by the revelation. Does it hurt? He asked with the direct curiosity that characterized his approach to new information. Sometimes, Remus admitted, but much less than it used to, thanks to modern treatments, and it's only 1 night a month that I need to be careful. Uncle Mooney, Harry said thoughtfully, trying out the nickname Sirius had mentioned. When you're a wolf, do you still remember being a person? Not exactly, Remus replied, settling into the comfortable chair by the fire that Harry had immediately designated as his spot. But the Wolfsbane potion helps me stay peaceful rather than dangerous. It's manageable now, in ways it wasn't when I was younger. The integration of Remus into their household happened as naturally as everything else had, with Harry acquiring yet another adult who could share memories of his parents and help guide his development. More importantly, Remus brought a calm, scholarly perspective that balanced Sirius's emotional intensity and Petunia's practical focus. It's like having different kinds of parents for different kinds of problems, Harry observed during one of their evening conversations. Sirius for magic and fun things, Aunt Toonie for real-world things and feelings, and Uncle Mooney for books and questions about how things work. And all of us for loving you, Petunia added, pulling him close, for the kind of casual hug that had become routine in their expanded household. It was that evening, as they sat together in the renovated sitting room of Grimmauld Place, while Harry read aloud from a book about magical creatures, and Remus offered commentary on which illustrations were accurate, that Harry made the observation that crystallized how complete their transformation had become. Sirius, he said, looking up from his book with the serious expression that meant he was working through something important. Is it okay if I call you Daddy sometimes? I know you're my godfather, but you take care of me like a daddy does. And Aunt Toonie says families can be made in lots of different ways. Sirius's expression went soft, with something that might have been tears. I would be honored if you wanted to call me that, Harry. Good, Harry said with satisfaction, returning to his book. Daddy for magical things, Aunt Toonie for everything else, and Uncle Mooney for when I need to understand complicated stuff. Petunia felt her own eyes fill as she watched this moment unfold. Harry, confident and secure, surrounded by adults who loved him unconditionally and supported his growth into whoever he was meant to become. It was so far from the frightened, suppressed child she'd rescued from Privet Drive that sometimes she could barely believe they were the same person. But they were the same person, just Harry as he was meant to be, given the love and freedom to grow into his full potential. And sitting in their warm, magical home, with the sound of his laughter filling the air, Petunia knew they had finally found their way to the family Lily would have wanted for her son. Chapter 12. The Boy Who Was Loved. September arrived in London with the crisp promise of new beginnings, and for the first time in his 7 years of life, Harry Potter was starting a school year with the eager anticipation of a child who expected good things to happen to him. St. Bartholomew's Primary School was a short walk from Grimmauld Place, with cheerful red brick buildings and playground equipment that gleamed with fresh paint applied over the summer holidays. More importantly, it was a place where Harry could simply be Harry, not the boy who lived, not the magical child with a complicated past, but just another 7-year-old beginning year 3 with new supplies and carefully labeled uniforms. "Remember," Petunia said as they approached the school gates on his first morning, "if anyone asks about magic, you just say some people in your family work in very specialized fields that are hard to explain. It's not lying. It's just keeping family business private." Adjusting the strap of his new school bag with the careful attention he brought to all important preparations. "And if someone's being mean to another kid, you get a teacher," Sirius said firmly. "No magic, no matter what. But you can definitely speak up for people who need help. That's what good people do." "Like Mummy and Daddy did," Harry added matter-of-factly. Standing up for people, even when it was dangerous. Without the shadow of grief that had once characterized any mention of James and Lily, was perhaps the clearest measure of how far he'd come. Harry still missed the parents he'd never really known, but he no longer felt their absence as an open wound. Instead, their memory had become something precious and inspiring, woven into his understanding of who he wanted to become. Mrs. Henderson, his Year 3 teacher, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the sort of calm competence that came from decades of working with children who were navigating the complex business of growing up. She greeted Harry with the same warm professionalism she offered all her new students, but within the first week, it became clear that his academic development was anything but typical. "Harry's reading comprehension is remarkable," she told Petunia during their first parent conference. "He's testing at least 2 years above grade level, and his writing shows a sophistication of thought that's quite unusual for his age." "Has he had any specialized tutoring?" "He's always been curious about books," Petunia replied carefully. "And he's had access to extensive libraries, plus several adults who enjoy discussing literature with him." It was true as far as it went. The magical books at Grimmauld Place had pictures that moved and occasionally offered commentary on their own plots, while Remus had spent countless hours reading with Harry and encouraging him to ask questions about everything from character motivation to historical context. The combination had produced a child who read voraciously and thought deeply about what he encountered on the page. "His social development is equally impressive," Mrs. Henderson continued. "He's naturally inclusive with his classmates, shows genuine empathy when others are struggling, and has already become something of a leader during group activities. You should be very proud. He's clearly a child who's grown up feeling secure and valued." The observation made Petunia's chest tight with gratitude. Secure and valued, such simple words to describe something that had seemed impossible just 2 years ago. Harry, who had once cowered in cupboards and flinched at raised voices, was now the sort of child other children naturally gravitated toward. for comfort and guidance. The transformation was perhaps most evident during the incident with Marcus Pemberton in late September. Marcus was a quiet boy who had started the term with obvious anxiety about making friends, and who had unfortunately attracted the attention of two older students who seemed to find his nervousness entertaining. Harry had apparently observed their increasingly aggressive teasing during lunch breaks for several days before deciding to intervene. Marcus was crying by the fence, Harry explained to Petunia that evening over dinner, and those boys were calling him names and saying he was too stupid to be in year 3. So I went over and told them they needed to stop being mean. And what did they say? Sirius asked, though his expression suggested he was proud rather than concerned about Harry's intervention. They said I should mind my own business, and that Marcus deserved it for being a baby. So I told them that picking on people smaller than you just proves you're not very brave, and that actually brave people protect others instead of hurting them. Good lad, Remus murmured approvingly. Standing up for those who can't defend themselves is always the right choice. Did the older boys listen to you? Petunia asked. Harry nodded. I think so. And Marcus asked if he could sit with me at lunch tomorrow, which I said yes to because everyone should have friends to eat with. The casual way he described defending a classmate, as if kindness toward vulnerable people was simply the natural order of things, spoke volumes about the values he'd internalized during his years with them. This was a child who had learned that love was expressed through protection and support, not dominance and control. Your parents would be very proud of you, Petunia told him, and meant it completely. Harry's integration into school life continued smoothly through October and into November, with regular reports of academic achievement and social success. He joined the school's reading club, volunteered to help younger students with their library books, and somehow managed to excel at both football and chess, despite having radically different skill sets required for each activity. He's a remarkable child, Mrs. Henderson told Petunia during their November conference. I've been teaching for 23 years, and I can honestly say I've rarely seen a student who combines intellectual curiosity with such genuine compassion for others. Whatever you're doing at home, please keep doing it. The school's Christmas performance was scheduled for the second week of December, with each class contributing songs, poems, or short dramatic pieces to celebrate the season. Harry's class had chosen to perform a poem about the importance of kindness during difficult times, a selection that Harry had apparently influenced through his suggestion that the best Christmas stories were about people taking care of each other. Will everyone come? Harry asked the week before the performance, reviewing his lines with the careful attention he brought to all public responsibilities. Daddy and Aunt Toonie and Uncle Mooney. We wouldn't miss it, Petunia assured him. All 3 of us will be there, cheering you on. I want everyone to see my whole family together. The evening of the performance, St. Bartholomew's Assembly Hall, filled with parents, siblings, and extended family members gathered to celebrate their children's achievements. Petunia, Sirius, and Remus found seats near the front, where Harry would be able to spot them easily, and settled in to watch with the proud anticipation of adults who had invested considerable energy in helping a child reach this moment of confident public presentation. When Harry took the stage with his classmates, standing tall and straight in his carefully pressed school uniform, Petunia was struck by how completely he belonged in this setting. This was a child who felt at home in the world, who expected good things to happen, and approached new experiences with curiosity rather than fear. In winter's darkest, coldest days, Harry recited, with his classmates, his clear voice carrying easily through the hall. When frost and snow hide summer's ways, we find our warmth in kindness shared, and know that someone always cared. The simple poem, delivered by a group of 7- and 8-year-olds who genuinely seemed to understand what they were saying. Had several parents reaching for tissues, but for Petunia, watching Harry smile confidently at his family in the audience before delivering his final lines, the moment represented something far more profound than seasonal sentiment. This was proof that love could heal even the deepest wounds. This confident, compassionate child had once been the frightened boy locked in a cupboard, convinced that he deserved whatever cruelty adults chose to inflict. Now he stood on stage surrounded by friends, secure in the knowledge that he had 3 adults who would always be there to support and protect him. Beautiful, Remus murmured as the performance concluded and the audience erupted in applause. James and Lily would be amazed to see him like this. "I think they can see," Sirius said quietly, his eyes bright with emotion as he watched Harry take his bow with obvious delight. The reception after the performance was a cheerful chaos of children showing their families around classrooms, while teachers shared stories about academic progress and social development. Harry led his 3 guardians from display to display, with the enthusiasm of someone who was genuinely proud of his school and wanted to share every detail of his daily life. "This is where we do maths," he explained, stopping at his desk to show them the exercise books filled with carefully completed problems. "And Mrs. Henderson says I'm ready to start working with the Year 4 books because I understand fractions really well." "That's wonderful," Petunia said, examining his neat handwriting and the teacher's encouraging comments written in red ink beside his solutions. "And this is my essay about my family," Harry continued, pulling out a composition notebook and turning to a page titled, "The People Who Take Care of Me. I wrote about all 3 of you and how you each help me with different things." The essay was written in Harry's careful script, with occasional cross-outs where he'd changed his mind about word choices. But the content was clear and heartfelt. "My family is different from some families because I have 3 grown-ups who take care of me instead of just 2. My daddy Sirius is my guardian, which means he makes sure I'm safe and teaches me about magic. My Aunt Toonie helps me understand the regular world and gives the best hugs when I'm sad. My Uncle Mooney knows about everything and helps me with hard questions. I used to live with different people who weren't very nice to me, but now I live with people who love me very much. My teacher says families can be made in lots of different ways, and what matters is that everyone takes care of each other. I think my family is very good at taking care of each other. All 3 of my grown-ups loved my mummy and daddy, who died when I was little. They tell me stories about them, so I can know what they were like. Sometimes it makes me sad that I don't remember my mummy and daddy, but it also makes me happy, because I know they would like the people who take care of me now. The best thing about my family is that no one ever gets angry at me for asking questions, or for being different. They say being different is good, and that I should always be exactly who I am. That makes me feel very safe and happy." Reading the essay over Sirius's shoulder, Petunia felt tears prick her eyes. Here, in a 7-year-old's straightforward prose, was the complete story of their transformation, from a broken, traumatized child to a confident boy who understood his worth and trusted in the love that surrounded him. "This is beautiful, Harry," she said, her voice slightly rough with emotion. "Mrs. Henderson says I might read it at the assembly next month," Harry said proudly. "She thinks other kids would like to hear about how families can be different, but still good." That evening, after they'd returned to Grimmauld Place and Harry had changed from his school uniform into comfortable pajamas, they settled into their nightly routine, with the comfortable familiarity of a tradition that had evolved organically over months of shared life. Harry chose 2 books from his collection, one about magical creatures that Remus would read with scientific commentary, and one about a boy who learned to be brave that Sirius would perform with dramatic voices. "Tonight," Petunia announced, settling into the chair beside Harry's bed, while Sirius and Remus arranged themselves on either side. "I want to tell you about the time your mother tried to teach our neighbor's cat to play fetch," Harry asked with delight, snuggling deeper into his blankets, while keeping his eyes fixed on Petunia's face. She was convinced it was possible if she just approached it scientifically enough. Petunia continued, her voice warm with the memory. "She spent an entire summer afternoon throwing a ball for Mrs. Patterson's tabby cat, trying different techniques and taking notes about what worked and what didn't." "Did it work?" Harry asked. "Eventually, yes," Sirius added with a grin, "though I think the cat was just humoring her. Lily had that effect on creatures. They wanted to make her happy, even when she was asking them to do completely unreasonable things. Like what Uncle Mooney does when I ask him to explain how transfiguration works even, though I won't learn it properly for years," Harry observed with the satisfied logic of someone who had identified a pattern. "Exactly like that," Remus agreed, settling more comfortably in his chair. "Your mother had the gift of making people want to live up to her faith in them. It's one of the things that made her so special." "Do I have that too?" "You do," Petunia said firmly. "I see it every day, the way you believe the best of people and help them believe the best of themselves. It's one of your greatest gifts, just like it was hers." They continued sharing stories as Harry's eyes grew heavy. Tales of James's pranks that always ended with acts of kindness. Memories of Lily's fierce loyalty to anyone she considered family. Descriptions of the way the two of them had looked at each other like they'd discovered something miraculous. "They would love this," Sirius said softly as Harry finally drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the gentle voices of the adults who had dedicated themselves to his happiness and security. "They would love knowing he grew up feeling this safe and loved." "I think they do know," Petunia replied, watching Harry's peaceful face in the soft lamplight. "I think somehow they can see that he became exactly the person they hoped he would be." Outside the windows of Grimold Place, London settled into its December quiet, with street lights glowing against the early darkness, and the distant sounds of other families going through their own evening routines. Inside, in a room that had been transformed from the austere headquarters of pure-blood supremacy into a comfortable child's bedroom, filled with books and toys and evidence of unconditional love, Harry Potter slept deeply and without fear. He was no longer the boy who lived, defined by a single moment of survival in his infancy. Instead, he had become something far more precious, a boy who was loved, completely and without reservation, by adults who had chosen to build their lives around his happiness and growth. And, in his dreams perhaps, he could feel the presence of parents who had died to protect him, now able to rest in peace, knowing their son was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by family who would never let him forget how much he was wanted, how much he was valued, and how much he was loved. It was, Petunia thought, as she turned off the lamp and settled in to listen to his peaceful breathing for a few more minutes, exactly the ending Lily would have written for her son's story. Not an ending really, but a beginning. The start of a life lived in love instead of fear, surrounded by people who had learned to choose courage over comfort and hope over despair.